Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this urban conference together. Strategies on how to make the city of tomorrow. Actually, this is a bit of the pre-conference session, because of course tonight we will open with a grand opening, the festival We Make the City. A festival which actually is trying to make cities better. And of course, everybody here in the room knows that cities face many challenges today. Continuous growth, climate change, but also the limits of non-renewables, and societal dynamics like globalization, migration, affects change in the urban economy. The composition of neighborhoods and the way we work. And around the world, we see an increased awareness that in order to tackle these challenges on that scale, we need to work together. Would have been nice. Okay, we need to work. Yeah. Thank you. So this afternoon, we will setting the stage for this 5-day conference all over Amsterdam and the metropolitan region. And we look at approaches that successfully experimented with collaboration between different stakeholders. And we'll do that with a variety of lenses. Hopefully we can inspire each other and learn from each other on how you can, construct, design strategies to solve problems in a way which is inclusive and sustainable by working together with all these different stakeholders. In Amsterdam, we find this particularly a very interesting subject because we feel that there is a big history in the Netherlands around multi-stakeholder approaches or collaboration. It first started when we had to think of how to protect the city from being flooded. And we created actually the first democratic institutions around water management long time ago. And over time, you see that this resulted in actually a word in Dutch, which is polderen, which means working together with different stakeholders. And in Amsterdam, we have tried to renew that notion of collaboration, and we call that the Amsterdam approach. We're kind of like a proud city, you will notice during the coming 5 days. And in 2016, Amsterdam won the Innovation Capital of Europe Award because of its urban innovation ecosystem consisting of all these stakeholders from public, private and non-private actors, which work together to make the city better. So this afternoon, we're going to see best practices, or shall we say, best processes to collaborate in a much more inclusive way with all these stakeholders. And we'll see best practices or processes from Mexico, Sao Paulo, New York, London, Amsterdam, Tehran, and Mumbai. So you'll get the entire world presented here on this stage, and we're very proud and honored that all these fantastic people who are experimenting in new ways of collaboration will share their stories with you. And we'll have 8 speakers, and we've organized the event 4 times half an hour, 2 presentations from different perspectives, different cities, and then a 10-minute discussion. What can we learn from the different approaches? What are similarities? What are differences? And if you want to join in the conversation, please do, because in this venue, we always believe that the most wisdom is in the crowd. So please share your questions, your thoughts in that 10-minute discussion we'll have. And then the second half hour will start 2 presentations, 10 minutes discussion, and we'll do that 4 times. And then we'll close off with all participants here on stage, and you can ask your last questions, and then we'll close off this pre-conference. Is that okay with everybody? Good. Yes, good. So the good thing to know is that these people from all over the world who will be joining here on stage probably never met, not even before this conference. Or to prepare this conference, we have asked them, because we really love their stories and their processes projects, but they flew in either this morning or yesterday evening, and we sent them into town. So we had no prep session. So sometimes they don't even know what the other story is about. So it's going to be very exciting to see what happens when these people cross their thoughts on this stage. Good. This festival is one of the partners of this festival, is a very prominent partner, initiator of this festival, of course, is the city of Amsterdam and its metropolitan region. So it's really a very good idea to start off with somebody from the city of Amsterdam, an official. We had to think about the translation of his title, and we decided to call him the chairman of the East District. It sounds really New Yorky, don't you think? Chairman, stadsdeelvoorzitter van Oost, in Dutch, yeah. He's just been put in office, and we're very proud that he's here to open this pre-conference of We Make the City. Give him an Amsterdam welcome to the stage, Maarten Poorter.
Thank you, Natasha, and great to see you here all in Amsterdam. It's absolutely wonderful that we host this conference for the next 5 days here in Amsterdam. Absolutely interesting program, and I look forward to all the conversations we'll have together. So we are amongst us. This is the pre-conference, and it's good to say a few words about what the Amsterdam approach is. And I have to admit, I was asked to say a few words how I work with the Amsterdam approach, and I had to think, what exactly is then the famous Amsterdam approach to me? Because I think the label sounds really appealing, and it's absolutely great that we won the prize. But it's good to realize what you do and how you work with this approach all day. And like Natasha said, I'm for 4 weeks in office. We just had elections, and now I've been 8 years member of City Council, and for now I'm an administrator in East. And it's really good to think how we make neighborhoods lively, how we innovate in neighborhoods, and how we make sure that all the people living in neighborhoods are really involved in making their own neighborhood a little bit better place. And it's good to rethink what we are doing, to rethink what the role of government is, and how we make sure that we are really open for new ideas, how we attract people, how we really participate, not just as a trick that we say, okay, we organized a participative process so that we can say we listen to the people. No, how we really learn from new ideas in neighborhoods. And I think that's the core of what we call the Amsterdam approach, that we make this a part of our DNA, and that we work always with the people together instead of just for the people. And I think a lot of groups here present today, we work with them every day. The knowledge institutions, the Hogeschool of Amsterdam, the universities of Amsterdam, it's really important to cooperate together and to learn together. Institutions like this, we're in the Zwijger, it's a really important place for city makers to have debate together, to meet new people, to share new ideas, and to go home and to work and to implement new ideas really next day. It's absolutely important to work together with NGOs and entrepreneurs. I made a round on the market, on the Dappermarkt. You should go there if you have time this morning. And it's so good to have conversations about how we make this place a little bit better. And it's so important to do this not just in the physical field, how to build houses, but also in terms of sustainability and the social field. How do we work on a better welfare of people living in Amsterdam? What kind of cities do we want to build? And how do we make sure that people have better lives? Me, myself, have been working on loneliness in Amsterdam. This place, we had a week just thinking about a wicked problem as loneliness, a taboo in a sense, and how we make sure that people feel more involved in the city. In that sense, it's also a great part of innovation in my perspective. I like wicked problems. It's good to think about tough problems and to share ideas together and make sure we make it a better city. So, in a few more words, it's good to have you here. So many people from different countries. We hope you like Amsterdam. Feel very welcome. And I think it's a great idea to build a network, to learn from each other, to visit each other's cities, and to see how we can the world a better place together. And it's really important to move to action instead of just words. Let's just start doing it. Less talking. Let's do it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, No, Mr. Porter, 1 second, because that's always a bit of a... If you have an entire afternoon of talking ahead,
Yeah.
it's quite confronting if somebody says, let's start doing and less talking. For me, as a moderator, that really now immediately creates a problem. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
The idea is, you're now heading the team in the government in East. And in this house, where we always try to find new initiatives and try to find these city makers, East has probably been the district of Amsterdam where the most initiatives we put it on this stage.
Yeah.
Especially around participatory budgeting, for instance. What are your plans? I mean, can we actually, because you are the man of the action, I now know, and not the words. So what are you going to do in East around that Amsterdam approach and, for instance, participatory budgeting?
Yeah, what we do, what we already do in East, but we try to do this already in the whole Amsterdam, but we started really getting all people involved if possible by consultation via internet, let people propose new plans, let them discuss them on the internet, and even if possible, let them budget them. And that's a real important step, that you say this is the budget for all the people living in this district. You can say how we're going to spend this amount of money. It would be great, and we did some experiments. I mean, it's not yet a big thing. I know New York and Paris, for instance, do this already on a more larger level, so we can learn from those cities here in Amsterdam. But in East we did it, and it works, and people feel responsible for their own neighborhoods in more and more. And they ask for new programs. And in the new coalition program, we announced that we're going to do this.
Okay, thanks. Lots of success with all that action you have to do in all that collaboration and togetherness.
5 more days is acceptable. Huh? So that's and I think the expeditions, I heard about expeditions.
Yes.
Those are really
yeah, you can visit all areas of Amsterdam, and you can meet all these city makers and approaches here in Amsterdam and around the metropolitan region. So hopefully we'll meet you in one of those expeditions. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Well, let's continue the talk then. Let me interview a very important person in the city of Amsterdam if we talk about collaboration. Because in the sense of the city of Amsterdam, collaboration is a way to innovate. It's actually an example of social innovation. I think it's the only city in the Netherlands who has a function like his. He is the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer of the city of Amsterdam. Give him a welcome to the stage. Gerberon, where are you? Oh yeah. So Mr. Porter already mentioned, I mentioned it in my introduction, you see it a lot also on the WeMakeThe.City announcements, the almost already famous Amsterdam approach. What is it? Can you tell us a little bit, how did you come up with it? What is the notion behind that approach? Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Well, actually, from a city point of view, I would say it's especially admitting that we don't know it as well. So I would say the Amsterdam approach for us is saying, hey, we don't have the solutions to all the problems as well, so we need your help to think about this, to create perspective, and to execute on the solutions or on grabbing opportunities. And when we were pitching for the European Commission for the iCapital Award, actually we didn't say, well, we have one big project or whatever. We said, hey, we have like 28, I think we defined 28 challenges that are coming up to us, and the solution is not to make a big plan with all the answers thought of people by myself, because we're not competent enough to do that. So we need all the help we can get. And it's always a collaboration of citizens, companies, knowledge institutes, etc. And we really want to collaborate. It also means that you need to be open and transparent, etc. And yes, we can do this way better than we do right now. So that's what we're working on very intensely, with also the new political leadership in Amsterdam actually pushing on that. People like Maarten and others. But it's about, well, be as open as possible, make sure that you try to solve stuff with citizens and not for citizens only.
Yeah, so it's the humble acknowledgement that you do not know.
Yeah, it's actually a nice way to say that we're incompetent in a certain way.
Yeah. So that's kind of strange. So you're asked to make a bid for the iCapital Award, and you say, please give us the iCapital Award, a prize for the most innovative cities. We just don't know. We are incompetent. What kind of conversation did you have with the European
With the judges, yeah, actually it was an interesting discussion. Now, well, what we did, I mean, obviously was a bit different. But what we said is, I mean, there are all types of things happening in the world. I mean, on a higher level, you could say we go from the industrial age to the digital age, or well, whatever narrative you pick. But there are globalization, climate change, a lot of things are happening at the moment. And these are all things that are happening all around us. And we don't have, I mean, as a city, we cannot. I mean, when I started in my job, I mean, one of the first policy documents I got into my table was Amsterdam is not going to do anything with autonomous vehicles up to 2020 because it's not in a policy up to 2020. Okay, let's call Elon Musk and others then saying, hey, Amsterdam, well, we're going to stop this, not going to happen, basically. So a lot of things are happening. Look at what happened with all the platform economy stuff happening in Amsterdam. So it's not, we're not inventing it, basically. Things are happening and are invented all around us. So for us, it's, hey, how can we make sure we find ways to, well, adjust or stop what we can stop, or how to work with all these new things? Because we need different approaches. And that's, I think, the thing about the Amsterdam approach. It's never the same, I would say. So we don't have a solution for everything, a policy. So it's always, how can we work together with the things that are happening in the world? I mean, the internet. I mean, we don't control the internet. No. But we wanted that people in Amsterdam can work, everybody has access to it, that you learn people how to work with it, that it's illiterate, etc., etc. So I would say it's more in how to find a way to cope with stuff happening all around us.
Yeah, and to make it a truly iterative process where you just adjust your way of dealing with.
And this is hard for a city because we want to build a bridge, and we put in a bridge for 100 years. But I mean, when you look at policies around, well, the digital age, I mean, temporality is the starting point, actually. Yes. I mean, your software updates are being done on a secondary basis.
There's a permanent sense of experiment.
Absolutely.
Permanent, yeah.
Yeah.
So somehow this. You were successful. The iCapital Award was awarded to Amsterdam.
We're great marketeers in Amsterdam anyhow. So
I now know that there is a castle for, it's like 200-300 years. It was Muider Kasteel, and now it's called the Amsterdam Castle. So for the marketing purpose.
And Almere nowadays is Amsterdam Newtown.
Perhaps people from Almere. You cannot say that. Okay. Anyway. So you got the iCapital Award, and what was it exactly? What was the prize?
I mean, the prize was that we've won, obviously, a nice little reward. Flashy. Yeah, it's always a designed award. I'm not sure who designed it, actually, but some Amsterdam approach needed over there as well. And secondly, 900,000 million euros, basically, to spend on the celebration of being an iCapital. Yes. And we decided not to spend it to civil servants, but to find a way to work with our partners. Where we work on it, they're over there as well. It's the Pakhuis Zwijger, Waag Society, also Kennisland was involved, Amsterdam Smart City Economic Board. Together said, hey, we just need to make this something that's actually from citizens, because in Amsterdam we do stuff with citizens. Yes. So Maak je Stad was the program we started, basically, with 39 initiatives. I think in the end we supported 600 submissions to it, varying from somebody who needed to help build a website for a neighborhood committee to people who had brilliant idea to change whole streets, neighborhoods and buildings. And it's actually bottom up, and it's actually, we liked that a bit, basically, because it was a lot of energy and innovation with small amounts of money, instead of making big plans and, designed to fail.
Yeah, so the city makers could say, we want a little help, and you selected them with support, advice, access to the people who are... Okay, very good. And so
Thank
why
you.
did you... Well, that's the judgment. I'm not... Yeah. Okay. So how did that process of talking about that iCapital and all that new energy from these city makers result in WeMakeThe.City?
Yeah, and then we start to think, how can we make this an ongoing thing? I mean, we need to, celebrate innovation the whole year through. I mean, I'm getting paid to do that, so I need to say that. But then it's something which should be in the city, which is in the city, but we need to catalyze it, find ways to continuously help people who have brilliant ideas to bring them further, to work with us, to improve the city, etc. So instead of focusing on big events that were based on corporate events with all the big companies paying €1,000 a day, we thought we need to make an event on an annual base, which is open for everybody. I mean, tickets are €5 for most of the event, because we wanted to have a bit of, the idea that, things cost money in the end. So, but we wanted to create a platform where everybody actually could join. And this is not only an annual event, because it will be an annual event.
Really?
Or an annual 150 or 200 events, to be frank, but it's all in the same umbrella. But we really want to be this continuous process, actually. So we're also redesigning in the city. Hey, can we find ways to support initiative continuously? Not saying that we're going to pay for everything, obviously, because it's something in collaborations. Everybody needs to do an effort. But what can we find ways actually to, well, grab more transparency, more on a localized level, more custom-made, I mean, and not only from big programs and thinking. So I think We Make the City basically is for us now our flagship program stating, hey, this is We Make the City, all of us. And we're going to celebrate it 3 days a year, 5 days a year, in a festival like this. Yeah. But actually it's continuously what we want to keep doing with, well, events in Pakhuis Zwijger, but also all types of projects, new ways to fund stuff, new types of collaboration, new way of thinking, and, well, go forward into the world in that perspective.
So, and if I would see you on Sunday evening at the end of this 5-day festival, what is necessary for you to be really happy with the result? What would make for you this a great first edition of We Make the City? What do you hope to achieve?
I mean, it's about, did Amsterdammers actually see this as a success? Could they contribute? Could they get something from it, etc.? So it's in numbers of people joining events. That's the easy one. But secondly, was it relevant for everybody? I'm not sure how we're going to measure this. Probably it's a bit of a feeling as well.
Yeah, just
big data. We're going to watch you in mobile telephone signals on WhatsApp. No, but it's we're not. But I mean, this is about how can we. I mean, Amsterdam should be feeling that this is something that's owned by them. So the big challenge is how can we make sure every Amsterdammer has access to this platform, and not only people who are studying universities, etc. But how can we make sure this will be something of every Amsterdam? This will be the big challenge for this year and for next year after and next year after. How can we really be a platform for everybody, and not for people who actually already know how to. Well, people already have my cell phone number.
Okay. Does everybody here in the room has his cell phone number? No.
Well, too much people do, I think, actually.
Yeah. Okay. One final question. This afternoon pre-session, we decided to organize that to look at what in other cities are ways of collaboration, because we call it very proudly the Amsterdam approach, but of course all over the world, everybody understands that we need to work together in a different way, because otherwise we will never solve complex questions. What questions should I ask everybody?
I mean, I'll ask them how often they talk about their failures as well.
I'll ask everybody, do you talk enough about your failures? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for now. Ger Baron, CTO of the City of Amsterdam. Okay. Ready? Oh, so let's kick off with all these brilliant visitors to this festival and stage from all over the world. And we'll start with Mexico City. And after that, London. And we will then compare these two talks. We've asked them to give a presentation of about 10 minutes. There's a clock over there. If it's red, it's bad. If it's green, it's okay. So red is bad, green is okay. And it's about 10 minutes. And after the twice 10 minutes, we'll have a discussion here on stage. Let me introduce the first speaker. She's director and founder of Laboratorio para la Ciudad, and she's from Mexico City. Give her an Amsterdam welcome. Gabriela Gómez-Mont. Thank you.
Can I take? Hello, everybody. I'm very, very happy to be here. So basically, let me just see if we can get the presentation up. One moment. So Ming, I'll see if I can. Could I use your microphone? Still not up. Even the presentations are in Mexican time, so just to make a little bit of suspense. Well, while the presentation comes up, I might start. So as you'll see in the first slide, there's a question that has been haunting me as well as fascinating me for 5 years, which is how do we enter a city? especially when this is the city that I need to enter. This is Mexico City. For you that have not been there, it's 22 million people in the metropolitan area. Our subway, that you see a subway line going right there, moves 5 million people every day. Just one subway station moves 1 million. And besides the sheer magnitude, the diversity of this place is astounding. And I think that is one of our biggest resources, but it's also one of our biggest Achilles heels, because we also have problems of inequality that I think no other city has. And in many ways, I think this is talking about the future of cities. Probably cities that are coming from Asia, Latin America, Africa are going to look more like this than they will look more like Amsterdam. So trying to figure out what we do with our challenges and our issues is going to be really important, not only for us, but for others. So the subway, that's the scale of it, but it's also the depth of it. This is a project that I'll show very quickly, Zwijger, that we entered the subway and we started figuring out that every time that you drop down into the city, any place, anywhere, you find the whole world with its own language, its own forms. So thinking about the DNA of Mexico City, which is this and this and this and this and this and this and that. As well. So talk about togetherness. Like there is such an amazing social energy, so many challenges as well. But part of what we've been thinking about is how can we actually make political will meet social energy in Mexico City. And besides, to make things even a little bit more complex, there is this other city underneath the one that we have, which is the Aztec pre-Hispanic city. So how exactly do we enter a city? I also think it's really important that we start questioning these ideas of modernism that try to enter cities and think about cities as if we were city as a computer, city as machine, city as something to only be productive and efficient, and try to think about cities in other ways. Because in many ways, Mexico City, which is where modernism, many people say, came to become alive, is also where modernism came to die. So this is Mexico City as well. 60% self-constructed. And so in a certain sense, when you talk about making the city, we not only mean participation, but we mean the constructed city in and of itself. Another question that has obsessed me is, can we imagine a city from a different place? And this is basically what we've been doing for the last 5 years at Laboratorio para la Ciudad, which is the experimental arm/creative think tank of the Mexico City government reporting to the mayor. We're part of a family of international labs that Dan was part of at one point in time. And even though we're very different and depend on the cities that we live in, we do have in common an experimental ethos and a desire to be able to mitigate risk for government to try out things in other ways. My team is a small team, especially if you think that Mexico City government is 280,000 people strong. So 20 people. Average age is more or less 29 years, which is also the average age of Mexico City. So we like to think that we're also prototyping what government looks like and feels like for a new generation. One of the particularities of my team is also it's incredibly hybrid and transdisciplinary. So half of the team comes from disciplines that you'd imagine within government, such as urban geographers, civic tech, data analysts, political scientists, social scientists, but exactly the other half come from the creative field. So it's also artists, designers, filmmakers, historians, editors, activists, et cetera, et cetera. And everything that we do sits in that slightly uncomfortable but very interesting space, I think. And we are a brainchild of this thing. This is the place and the city that we are supposed to enter. And I'd like to think that what we try to do is, instead of just like being able to cut up the city in disciplines, it's how do we bring things together and start thinking about the urban, the political, the social, the creative, and the tensions and the translations that need to take place to think about cities from another way. We also love to think that there are new urban languages and political forms to be found, and that we specialize in the gap between things vis-a-vis the rest of the government. Like the conversations that are not being had, the ideas that are not necessarily present, the voices that are not being heard. In Mexico, there's a huge mistrust between government and civil society. The last Pew report said that only 8% of Mexicans actually believe in democracy. So, you know, that's actually a challenge. But we also think that there is a creative ethos that is very present in the creative fields that we need to put in place in the cities. How can we have this creative ethos also thinking about things like mobility, as civic participation, et cetera? This is a lab, and since the very beginning, we tried to embody what we profess. And this place here has turned a little space of government not only into a place of complaints and services, as is the rest of the buildings. This building has 4,000 bureaucrats in it, including ourselves, but also a place of debates and ideas. So this rooftop has seen everything from Perry Chen, co-founder of Kickstarter, to Minister of Finance of the UK, to people doing aggregate 4D printing, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a little bit what we try to keep, like a very agile and of bringing new ideas in. And as a good lab, we work in experiments, and I'll tell you a few of them. We've done everything from passing laws, such as the Open City Law, that when you get a creative team working on it, of course, it has to become something else as well. So it's also a dynamic law that has a capacity to update itself. I won't get into it much right now. We've also, after France, Mexico was a place where the Uber versus taxi debate got the most violent. So we also created a new methodology to see, can we have not easier, but more productive conversations that are getting incredibly intense and not doing society any good. We're also partnering with universities. So this is one day when we signed with 5 of Mexico City's main universities to think about data-driven policy and how we can have specific projects that better the quality of the city, because we really believe in collaborative societies, and that's actually what we're trying to prototype, to put all of these resources, such as UNAM, who has 350,000 students, believe it or not, to start working in the public good, because many times this giant that is Mexico City is siloed and not necessarily working together. So this is one of the examples that are coming from these working teams that are also composed of civic tech. This is AI that is meant for the first time being used in mobility in Mexico City, but for the buses that are actually for the most marginalized communities in Mexico City. So how do you actually, yes, bring in new technologies, but also think about equity and about being able to mend the divisions in the city? This is another team also working on integrating crowdsourced air quality data that is also dynamic, because Mexico City has been measuring air quality for the last 30 years, but on an average, very sophisticated machines, and now they have $700 little contraptions that are, since they're working with the Ministry of Environment, are now up to par with these very sophisticated, very big machines. Also thinking about how do we add to the social programs that already exist. This is Médico en tu casa. While some countries are right now discussing, if you don't have medical insurance, is anybody responsible for you? Do we just let you to die? Mexico City has more or less about 3,000 doctors that make house calls to some of the most marginalized houses for free, and that if you're sick, if you have anything, cannot go to the hospital, you will have a doctor come to you. The thing is, they've been writing this up on papers and et cetera, and this has not necessarily become data that the government and universities can use. So we're now, for the first time, generating this data that we will be able to query the system in real time. But besides these objective topographies and this very practical city, we also think that we need to take into account the social imaginaries, which is also the other side of the lab, and really think about the symbolic infrastructure of cities, because in the end we are creatures of meaning. So we think that we need to bring back the humanities in this thing of thinking and creating cities. So we're also working very closely with 6 of the main design universities in Mexico City and trying to bring in that creative ethos and another way of solving. So we just find it just as intriguing to work with people such as Gilberto Esparza, an amazing artist that did this contraption which is called nomad plants. So basically this plant has hydrophiliac legs, so it walks towards rivers. It takes for granted that the rivers are polluted because this is this day and age. And so it can actually purify water. It gives to drink to the plant. The plant in turn feeds the robot. It can live in the wild for about 1 month on its own. And besides, it runs away from people if and when they try to catch it. Like, this might seem a speculative project, but it's actually also an amazing way of talking about rivers and pollution to kids and to communities that are the ones that are unfortunately polluting some of these rivers. So how do you use that ethos of creativity that's scientifically sound, but also captures and provokes the imagination for us to think about other things? In this sense, we're also thinking the future is also subjective. So one of the things that we did when we crowdsourced the Mexico City Constitution was survey 31,000 people across 1,400 neighborhoods to basically figure out how we're making sense of the city that lives in people's heads, the subjective city. So we asked, what are the 3 words that come to mind? What are your biggest pleasures, your biggest pains? How do you imagine the future of the city? It might not surprise you after the images I saw of Mexico City that even though we prompted for positive futures, we got back Mad Max, dystopic, really wild thinking things. Does government need to think about that city in our heads? Do we need to think about, in terms of policy, of how we imagine the future of the city? I'd say yes. I think Brexit and Trump and a lot of things also locally have taught us that it's not only about objective data, it's not only the pollsters. Like, this is a cultural battle, if you will, or a cultural possibility. So we can now query this through age, gender, neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the most important question that tech is only an answer to is, what type of societies do we want to live in? Tech is not neutral, we've seen that as well. A new government comes in and the same system works for completely different purposes. So if we don't start, again, a social conversation, bring back politics, which I was very wary of when I stepped into government, but now I think is a great space of imagination and exploration, is this question here. And so one of our examples, and I'll end with this because I'm in red now, even though I had a few more examples, one of the things that we found incredibly interesting was crowdsourcing the Mexico City Constitution. It's one of the first constitutions to be had in this century. And so it was a fantastic opportunity to really think about not only Mexico City per se, but also cities, and I think we all agree with this in a festival such as this, are taking a completely different role in today's societies. And nowadays, they're actually even going against national policy. So what does that entail in terms of the ethos and the people that we want to be, and all the policy and all the social urban realities that we want to create with that amazing toolkit that can be laws? So it garnered quite a bit of attention, and I'm happy to say that even though the Constitution wasn't necessarily gathering a lot of interest from a younger generation, we managed to actually break a lot of records in terms of participation on different platforms such as Change, because we had different ways of bringing city voices in. And 75%, I think, of the proposals that were handed over are now part of the Mexico City Constitution. So this is the mayor, and we have this weird thing where now we have 17-year-olds whose ideas are drafted into the Constitution, and we have women, 60-year-old women that now have 50,000 followers and have become very active in the campaigns right now. Those are probably more followers than many congressmen in Mexico City. And another one who basically just entered because he thought, oh, well, what the hell, I'll just send an idea, and then gathered, I think it was 55,000 followers, and now he's completely changed his life and become an activist and is knocking on all of the mayor, like the campaigning possible mayors right now to say, I represent 55,000 people, these are my ideas. And one of the things that excites me the most in terms of the Mexico City Constitution is the right to the city that's inscribed there. And in terms of human rights, it's a very simple idea, which is, be it that you're a 3-year-old or a 70-year-old with a terminal illnesses that wants euthanasia as an option, be it that you're a transsexual, be it whoever you are, the city should belong to you. Under more philosophical terms, and that I think really brings in this hybrid ethos of the lab, if we go back to Lefebvre and if we go back to David Harvey, is the ultimate right to the city is the capacity to imagine a city, or the ability to imagine a city, because first we create our cities and then our cities in turn create us. And just to end on that last slide, these are the type of realities that exist because of the Constitution. Now, this is a 17-year-old transsexual that, thanks to the rights that she has in the Constitution, was able to to have a sex change with the support of government, psychological help, et cetera, et cetera. So I think cities are about amplifying the gamut of possibilities and really thinking about how this idea of a city can then seep in to everything that we do and that we are together. Thank you very much.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, very good. I really like amplifying all the time, so that's great. Let's go to the second speaker. He's from London. He's head of the Arab Digital Studio Mayor's Design Advocate. Please give him a warm welcome to the stage. Dan Hill.
Thank you. Gracias. incredibly hard to follow Gabriela, as you can imagine. But it's very nice to share the stage with her. We've known each other for a while. And yeah, in a way, the work that I was doing in Helsinki was part of this network that Gabriela talked about. But it was just so nice to see how Laboratorio Palaciedad has just gone on and basically done all of the things that we were just dreaming about. So that's super nice. But like I said, incredibly hard to follow, because I'm going to talk about dull, grey, Northern European cities, after all of that colour and diversity, including one round here, but I'm going to talk about London as well. We've been doing lots of work in Amsterdam, so I will talk about that as well. So my name's Dan, as you just heard, and I work for Arup, which is a big design company. Salome is in one of our teams. She's at the back somewhere. And the kind of work we've been doing with cities ultimately is very, very different to what Gabriela just described, but with the same instinct, the same ethos. We're coming often into urban development projects, urban design projects. This is for Arenaport, those of you that know Amsterdam, and how Arenaport might become a slightly more human place, if I can put it like this, in the nicest possible way. Of course, it's very human when there's a football match on there. And there's 50, 60, 70,000 humans there, but a lot of the rest of the time, it's not built for that the rest of the time. So we talked about how do we change that. So that's some of the work we've been doing. And it's absolutely building on what Gabriela says, the opposite of what traditional urban planning does. And Amsterdam is very good at doing both traditional urban planning and the more avant-garde innovative stuff. But it is the opposite of, that's Le Corbusier's right hand for the architects in the room, I'm sure you know it, hovering over a city from some time ago. It's the absolute opposite of this kind of top-down idea that we can predict everything and plan it, and then just build that, and then we kind of shove people into it and see how they go. That's happened many times here, and in London, and in numerous other places, and in Mexico City, as we heard. Instead, what we're talking about are things like this. I'm a trustee of this project, for full disclosure. This is the Participatory City project in London, in one of the roughest bits of London, Barking and Dagenham, which is in East London, the 9th poorest borough in the country. So although London is a very rich city, there's huge inequality, CF, Brexit, etc., etc. I don't need to say any more about that, I think. Barking is super tough, but the work that's going on there is absolutely an open platform for citizens to get things done, things that they would like to do with the city. So this right to the city is built on platforms like this. The desire from citizens is there. Participatory City Project did some research, and they show something like 60% of people, this was a survey of 50,000 people, so quite a big survey in the UK, 60% of people wanted to be actively engaged in their neighborhood, in the way that it happens, the way that it changes. Only 3% currently thought that they were in any way involved. And you probably know the 3% that managed to have time to go to the traditional community meetings. Not really representative. The outcomes, I won't go into this in detail because we don't have time, but it's super positive on almost any metric you could talk about. If you built a city with participation at the core of it, the outcomes ranging from sustainability to green infrastructure to business improvement to conviviality, health, well-being, ability to get on with others that aren't like you, the core idea of the city, goes up and up and up and up. So then it comes to cities like this, in Melbourne. This is a street project we've been working on in Melbourne. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about things like technology, not because we're not afraid of it and we run towards it and we try and understand what to do with it. As Gabriela pointed out, it's not neutral, you have to be very careful with it, but wouldn't it be interesting if you could unlock the potential of what currently at the moment in Melbourne, as you can see, is basically a car park pretending to be a street. It's not really a street at all. So this is a transformation we can do. We begin to introduce some data, we move the parking, angle it over there, you get the same number of cars there, you bring in a bike lane here, you try an autonomous shuttle over there, see how that goes. You've got some ride sharing in here, you bring the greenery in and so on, and then you do this, and then you do this, and then everything's happy and beautiful, and everything works, which is fine. And many of us in the room, I'm sure, can draw that kind of outcome. You can imagine what that might be. The difficult thing is, if you go from that to that, in Melbourne, people will try and kill you. It's like you talk about human right. They think it's a human right to have a car and park it there. So they will chain themselves to lampposts and if not, try and attack you. So you can't do that. You have to go really steady, step by step. Now, it turns out is a better way of doing planning. Instead of drawing the end and then crossing our fingers and we all pretend that that's going to happen in 2030 or 2025, we wiggle our way towards the future. It's like navigating a small boat towards the North Pole. We don't need to know exactly true north all the time. You just head off in a northerly direction and take regular readings, keep going northerly, and you'll get there. So this enables you to slide the technology in when it's ready, but this step-by-step approach also means you can take people with you. You can begin to talk about what would be the value of that nice street that I just showed you, bit by bit. And this is what cities all over the world are beginning to try to do. Barcelona, Paris, these are European ones, as you know, beginning to push parking out. We've done work on Sluisbert and Sloterdijk here, as well as Arenapoort, pushing the parking norms down as low as I can humanly get them within the limits of the law as it stands. And cities around the world are trying to do that. You also see the backlash there. So I've chosen those articles, obviously, because it shows the issue with just passing an edict and saying, we're going to try and get rid of parking and get rid of cars. For all of the good reasons that might be thought behind that, you're going to have a problem, even in forward-thinking cities like Oslo and Amsterdam and Barcelona. And Paris, I suppose. So the work we've done with cities, and this is, there's Salome, and this is the team from Arenapoort, actually Hans van der Marde, the planner on the right there, is beginning to understand from a city planning point of view, how do you work with these technologies, these new objects, these new spaces, and people as part of this process. So on these tables, we're not only sketching out what kind of things you might do. This is actually with Stockholm, same kind of principle. But how do you talk to people as part of this process? How do you involve them in that one way or another? This is in Sheffield last week, designing a new library with them, and we're giving them this kind of kit of parts. These are actually a part of a toolkit for citizens to decide what the new library should be in the centre of Sheffield. So which of the themes, what kind of spaces, what kind of activities, who better than the citizens themselves to define what the library is? The library is like the ultimate public institution in that sense. But how do we do that at the moment? How do we, in London, talk to people about the way that things are going to happen in their neighbourhood? So a new development is going to happen in your neighbourhood. The way we communicate with you is that we tie a piece of A4 paper to a lamppost, and we hope that you might look at it. We tie it in the rain, obviously, because it's often raining, so you're even less likely to look at it. Over time, it slides down the lamppost. You know, they end up being almost like a metaphor for the planning system generally. It's the least you could do. It's almost literally the least you could do as a city government to communicate with people. In a city as wealthy as London, with untold technology, when we can make Apple Watches and Teslas and things like this, we tie a piece of paper to a lamppost in the rain and hope you might look at it. I mean, look at the language on it. How does this affect you? How does what affect me? Something's going to affect me. You're immediately starting the conversation in a negative position, a kind of almost combative position. It's the same piece of paper, whether it's changing a door mechanism from one to another or a 9-story block of flats. It's written in the language of the Town and Country Planning Act 1944, which is not a language that humans really understand, I can tell you, but it's basically bureaucracy. And they just fade, or they end up, like, this is probably for dogs or rats, I don't know, maybe it's not for humans at all. So that's not good enough, right? So we can do a lot better, the kind of work that Gabriela just showed, the kind of work we're doing with the city governments, and indeed the stuff that we do in public. So I'm going to show you some tech in a minute, but to be clear, the answer isn't necessarily technology. Just a better piece of paper would be a start. You know, just actually designed and communicated in English in this case, and other languages for that matter, because it's London. A better meeting, you know, the stuff that the participatory project is doing, embarking, involves making a space downtown, like as with Gabriela's Laboratorio, where people can come and debate and discuss. You need to do these things face to face, to some degree, at least at some point in the process. I could go on with that for hours, seriously. So some things we've done, again, we work with Sheffield City Council to change the way they communicate their plan. So instead of the planner's drawings, we drew this, a whole map of the city. We hand drew it. It's funny, we have a 3D model of Sheffield, and we took a printout of the 3D model and then traced it by hand, which confused some of our colleagues no end. They said, you do know we've got a 3D model? It's like, yeah, I know. We want it to be hand-drawn because we want people to actually be engaged by it and to look into it. So we put these out in the city, and we communicated with people about what's going on in the plan. the increase in positive response, total number of responses and positive responses, just by changing the way that we drew the maps was extraordinary. This guy is in his, I don't know, late 80s or 90s. He was talking about a bit of the city, pointing to it, and said, that's where my great-grandfather used to keep cows. And this was, I don't know how old he is. He seemed to be 200 years old. So maybe this is 1850 or 1880, something like this. And that wouldn't have happened with the planner's drawings before. So we were pulling people in. That's just very, very basic. Something else we could do, though, which we're interested in is, this is a project we did with Ericsson, is what if you could have something else out in public and use technology? What would you do? So what if you had a little plaque on the wall there, which is actually a little transmitter, and you held your iPad or whatever you have, it could be a phone, over that, and it shows you in situ the proposed idea for that place. And that could be the community suggestion. We'd like a battery storage thing, or we want a little garden, or someone might say, well, I like your garden, but what about if we put some bike parking in there instead? It forces you to think about how you would communicate this. What's the value of a bike hub and a garden? Well, it's clean air and vegetables and maybe some jobs, or all kinds of things, social interactions. You can add comments on it and so on. Again, we might push people then from there to the actual meeting, because we don't think it's enough to say thumbs up, thumbs down on that idea. Yeah, there's a squirrel, I know. Always steals the show in our films. London's full of those bloody things, and rats. So we're not saying that you should do like thumbs up, thumbs down on that, because that simplistic kind of yes, no stuff isn't appropriate for something as complex as what happens in that space, or indeed Brexit, for that matter. Anyway, why would you do that kind of vote about something complex? So we're saying, but that's a platform that you could suggest ideas, you could understand them, it makes it more tangible instantly for people. It's, I see what that kind of thing is now. It's not written, as I showed you before, in the language of the piece of paper, although, as I said, a piece of paper might be a good job as well. Another way of doing that is people love these kind of models, because we all grew up playing with Lego and building blocks. So what if you have a meeting about this? Can you have a little bit of data associated with some of the objects in there? Now, and this is a slightly technical example, as in that's the amount of sunlight falling on that building when it sits like that. If Anna flips it around like that, then it's got less sunlight, so maybe you put vegetables on there instead of solar cells. And that was the sort of thing, again, you could do with a community and just say, well, what if we slide this around like this? Now, those meetings happen at the moment, but they don't really have the information in them. So sometimes you might make a suggestion, but you've got no real understanding of the implication. And we need to help citizens and policymakers, for that matter, understand, so what if you do slide that from there to there? What is the effect on the community or the outcomes? And it could be all kinds of things. It could be, will it create jobs? Will it improve the air quality? Will it create conviviality and social interactions, or in this case, sunlight? So we are interested in those things. And work that our colleagues at Ericsson R&D then did with UN Habitat in Johannesburg actually did this in Minecraft, which is interesting. Minecraft, it turns out, is an extremely good urban modeling engine with properties. So what they did here was they had a Minecraft model of the whole neighborhood. They gave that to school kids. The school kids modified the Minecraft model of the neighborhood, and then you go outside and you look at their modifications in situ. This is very early sketchy stuff, but this is working on a Google Tango phone, which is a phone you can buy, and it kind of works already. So this is really like early R&D. I'm not saying this is the answer. I'm not saying any of these ideas are good for Johannesburg, by the way. But you can imagine the possibility of a tool that, in this case, kids find super easy to use, that gives them a tool for them suggesting modifications, even if it unlocks, as Gabriela says, the idea that I can change my city. That would be a good thing to take away, leaving aside the actual proposal. So I'll just finish by talking about the last thing is, how do these technologies, whether it's autonomous vehicles or, in this case, energy generated locally and shared in the neighborhood, actually change the really fundamental participation, which is what could be owned locally. So at the moment, your heating in Amsterdam comes from the district or comes from the city or a big company. What if it's owned as local as possible, as in, this is an Australian one, by those houses? This thing is the only interesting thing that Elon Musk has ever done, I think, to be honest. But the battery unit, if not applied to then what they think a house looks like, which is what Tesla's proposal for a house is, but something like this becomes interesting because it asks the question, what happens to that energy? Who owns it? Is it our energy as the community? Do we decide how that works? And how does that going to work? You see the same thing in community-led housing, cooperative housing. This is Baugruppen in Berlin, beautiful projects, amazing buildings, 25–30% cheaper than the market makes because there's no property developer involved. So you take the property developer out, everything else is the same. It's a community buying apartments or investing in them. There's an architect and engineer, but they own it. So this is genuine participation. Same in Melbourne, same in Zurich, where now it's 30% of the city is cooperative housing, which is extraordinary. And the outcomes I won't dwell on because we don't have time, but are extraordinary. So the last slide. This is not smart cities that I've been talking about, although it involves technology. It's deliberately the opposite of the traditional smart city vision. It's very much bottom up and starting with people and then understanding what you could do if you then systematize that platform, build it into the way the city works. It's a completely different approach to planning and therefore a different culture we need to work through with cities, which is why the work that Gabriela and others do inside cities is as important as the work we do with them. And finally, that's going to mean this relationship between active citizens and active government. It also implies for any designers in the room a very different type of design practice as well. But this relationship between citizens and governments is completely changing from now on, and that's a huge opportunity. Thank you.
Yes, so Gabriela, join me on stage. So now you have 4 minutes of your time, you too. So now we have 4 minutes left to have a brilliant discussion. So to the other speakers, please stick to your 10 minutes because then it helps. We can have some collaborative talking. Dull European cities, very colorful Latin American city. What, according to you, is the idea you both share, of course, a vision? Imagining the city, making the city, owning the city, right? I mean, that is kind of like the both of you are telling that is the way forward. What is the biggest challenge? You talk about a cultural shift. What is the biggest challenge to actually get there, according to you?
Well, I have a feeling that one of my huge heartbreaks when I stepped into government was I thought, because I don't think I mentioned this, but all of my team, except my lawyer and the administrator, it's our first time in government for all of us. So this is very much a citizen-driven agenda in many ways, and we're the link between that and the mayor's office. One of the things that I thought when I stepped into government very naively was that you just bring in the people and the people will solve everything without really thinking that that's actually what government is for starters. You know, people raising their hand and saying, I will help with health, I'll help with transportation. And then figuring out very much what Dan was saying, that we actually have a 200-page book that speaks about this, that in a certain sense, urban pedagogy is necessary because many times...
Urban pedagogy?
Yes,
okay.
And social pedagogy, because many times people don't make the best choices, let alone for their neighbors, which is already a really huge leap, but actually for their future selves. So how do you actually start, first of all, thinking about participatory scaffolding, if you will, that different voices, different talents, different type of inputs are necessary in different parts of the processes to guarantee a better outcome? For starters. Second of all, that if we are really serious about governance, for example, that gets thrown about everywhere and anywhere nowadays, we probably need to rethink the role of government that worked very well under a modernist paradigm of, you know, efficient cities, services, complaint. Nowadays, I think government has to become more of a catalyzer for citizen talent and also needs to give new skills to their population. So this is what we're doing in terms of, let's say, participatory budgets in Mexico City, which are 50 million, and figuring out what the outliers are of people that have done amazing projects with small budgets that have created other governance structures, and figuring out that there's a whole history of social movements in Mexico City that mostly nobody knows about just because of the span, that could actually feed into very contemporary notions of governance.
Yeah, I like the word city pedagogy. We need to learn a different way of learning, right? Of knowing. Dan, what if other cities here in the room want a lab, like you were talking about, want, let's say, an experimental learning environment, what is the essence of that, according to you? What do they need to know for sure before they start?
I think one of the things is getting used to the idea that we can't know before we start.
Yes, that's exactly. Start with the incompetence.
But not
idea.
I think not incompetence. It's just it's that the whole way that city governments have been trained to work and think, because we arguably grew up in as cities for the 19th century in Europe anyway, and we created our municipalities over that same time period, 17th, 18th, 19th century, building cities, making big, bold decisions, all of those things.
Blueprinting.
Exactly. And that culture, though, is still pervading into a time when we've built a lot of the city. You know, retrofitting now is in Amsterdam, leaving aside a few new districts.
Yes.
The job is, how do we introduce these things into a city actually which was formed in 1400 or 1500?
Yeah, almost 750 years ago.
Exactly, and those patterns are still there as well.
Yeah.
But so it's a very different culture around that. And everything from the minutiae of public procurement has been built on this idea of plan and predict and deliver.
Yeah.
So literally, I always fall over in this one as a designer when I'm working with a city and they say, can you just tell us what's going to happen before you do it?
Yeah.
And it's, well, not really, because that's the whole point of doing it. You know, it's like, I don't know.
What is the result?
Yeah. So tell me we can talk about what the outcomes might, what do you want the outcome to be? Do you want healthier people, smarter people, richer people, whatever? You know, it's going to vary from city to city, safe people. But we will not know the mechanism until we actually start the work. So you have to be open-minded enough and brave enough to start with a blank piece of paper and a new process. And the kind of team that Gabriella set up and that we've set up elsewhere can be your testing environment for that. It's super important. Ultimately, it doesn't just stay as a lab, by the way, that it actually obviously then migrates across into the city, because it's easy. You know, we could talk about this a lot more, but it's sometimes easy if you can to be ignored if you get called the studio or the lab or the thing on the side that's doing the different stuff.
Nice experimental pilots.
Exactly. But as you said, there's 280,000 people in this municipality, in your case, working in the other direction.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of learning things there from how do you then get that out across the body. But there's this big, big perception issue, which is baked into EU procurement all the way down, where we have to start thinking more about the outcomes and then agree on this and then think about, well, now let's explore how we might get that. And that's work to do. I can't tell you until I do it, you know?
That's why I always love to quote him of the city as a commons, the notion of design a beautiful process.
Yeah.
So without knowing what the outcome will be, but put all your quality in designing the process, not the best practice, but the best process.
Yeah.
Thanks. Room, audience. Yes.
Both from Mexico. Your city is much bigger, so your problems are bigger. Air quality. You said every car can only drive on half of the days, so everyone got 2 cars. What did you? What was your next step? Poverty. Babies are born in the sewage system, and babies drown in the sewage system until when the rain is getting pushing everyone the air out of the sewage system. So did you find a solution to that as well?
That's okay. Can you solve world peace after that, please? Create world peace.
The sewage system thing is probably more of a myth, which is interesting because I mean there's so much dystopic imaginary surrounding Mexico City, and it is that. But one of the things that I most love about Mexico City, that it's everything you imagine it to be, and also its opposite. The other slides that were left behind talked a little bit about how to deal with entering the city in a city that's very diverse. So the sewage one, it's probably, we do have 2, the only city that has 2 professional divers. Australia folded before we did, of sewage, professional sewage divers, if you will, that take the mud out, like they'll take cars out and things out so the city doesn't flood. So that one's a rumor. Air quality is a very important one. And we've been working on several things in terms of mobility. There's only less than 30% of people ride a car in Mexico City. So we have one of the most painful commutes in the world with that percentage, which imagine if other people are getting in cars. And we have 1.2 people riding in every car. So basically we started doing several experiments in terms of cultural shifts to do mobility and hence air quality, plus the projects that I just showed, which is helping the government measure now on a pedestrian ground level, which weirdly enough was something that we were gonna do before Dan left us for Arab when he was at Future Cities Catapult in London. It never let you forget Dan. And
I knew it was in good hands.
But basically one of the things that we found, and this is something to the experimental lab, and to Dan's point of how do you make these things not become a marginal thing, or let that margin actually seep into the centerfold conversations, is that we found out that the leading cause of death in children and adolescents, in children in Mexico, and the second leading cause of preventable death in Mexico City is car accidents. So we basically verged and said, okay, we can leave cultural shifts behind for a couple of months, and we've been very actively working in road safety, and now have 18% less traffic accidents in a year and a half of work.
Wow.
With actually best practices. This is not necessarily all that experimental. The experimental part, talking about togetherness, is that since 2 of my team members have been activists for 10 years, and they're now working in government, which is, I mean, there's anecdotes to tell galore. It's a tense-filled place. We brought in all of the activists to work with government because there was much more know-how about the best practices there than there was within government. So we made that conversation shift towards the outside of government, which I think is, you know, about the distribution of decision-making ideas, best practices, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. One last final remark from the audience. Yes?
Yeah, question for Dan, actually. You use technology a lot in your work. I can see that in your presentation. But in my experience, high educated people are really well connected to these devices. But low educated people less, and sometimes they don't even have the money for these devices. So how do you deal with this?
Inclusion.
Yeah, and it's why I always really carefully say, like with the planning notice thing, it could also be a better piece of paper. So really, what we're looking at there is a system approach, and using the tech where it can do only the thing the technology can do. Everything else has to be done in every other way. So about the place I showed you and the suggestions for it, let's do that with a council meeting, a town hall meeting. We do that with a kiosk on a Saturday. We get to the shopping mall and we talk to people. You do all of those things as well. There's one thing that tech could do, which is kind of show you things that don't yet happen there in that way in situ. You know, and so we kind of drilled it down to that's the last thing we can do with that bit. Yes. We also have to do everything else. So we call this kind of service design approach, I'm sure you know, which is looking at all of the potential touch points. The smartphone is kind of useful because it is in many, many people's hands, including in London. Poorest people actually also have smartphones, usually, almost all the time. It doesn't mean that you can rely on that technology because that's a more expensive smartphone. So it really gets into details.
Yes.
But yeah, there's something about this starting with people, and the research flushes out that first thing straight away. And that's what we do. We start with people and then tech, or people and then buildings. That's the other way around.
Yes, thank you. Give them an applause, please. Thank you. We're going to the second round of speakers. And so I'm sticking to the 30 minutes. So as long as that is fine, and then if you want to talk more, you talk more. And there is a clock. Okay. We're having a Dutch guy here, but he's talking about New York. He's an architect and owner of One Architecture, and he's going to talk. And he's also part of Rebuild by Design in New York. So we're going to introduce the perspective of America by a Dutchman, which is quite. It could also have been called New Amsterdam, right? Give him a warm welcome, Matthijs Bouw.
Actually a story that starts in Amsterdam, because I was hanging out in a bar at Loosje with my Danish friend Bjarke Ingels after Sandy, and we sort of saw these television images, and we were sort of flabbergasted that this could happen in a city like New York. We were sort of flabbergasted how unprepared people was. There was a sort of sign of atomization. You see that the conversations were about rebuilding rather than preparing, and for us as Europeans, we thought, hey, we need to have a role there. We need to think about the power of design as a way to sort of show integrated thinking and communicate that and talk about that. So that's why we started a team to work in the Rebuild by Design competition. And in that competition, we quickly discovered how much of New York is in the floodplain, and what a huge issue that was, particularly, for instance, in Lower Manhattan, where you see here the floodplain indicated, and where New York had its plans to sort of build an integrated flood protection system around it. And the question is really, how do you build such an integrated flood protection system? Would you, if you have to build walls or levees, would you then sort of kill the relationship between the city and the waterfront that has been so carefully restored recently? Or would you have to build temporary measures, which from a logistical point of view, it's not for nothing that Merkel is so chagrined here, that are very, very complex. And so we took our cue from the High Line as a sort of piece of infrastructure that is not used anymore, and that became a great park. And that's really revitalized the city. And our idea was, well, if you combine infrastructure with a thought about program, why wait for the infrastructure to be decommissioned? Why not build a resilience or coastal protection infrastructure which is immediately thinking about program, about people, and then tries to think about the sort of diversity of programs that you have in the city? So our scheme for this was a scheme that we called the Big U, and it was the idea to sort of think of an integrated flood protection system in New York not as one big system, but really as a sort of chain of very local interventions, very local programmatic ideas where we could build not only an infrastructure but a social infrastructure, basically giving birth to the sort of love child of these two people, Robert Moses, the guy of Big, and Jane Jacobs, the woman of Community. So our proposal was really a set of very different types of solutions, each tailored to a neighborhood for flood protection. Sometimes in pavilions, sometimes in buildings, sometimes sort of integrated in parks. And that proposal really came about in a very intensive process, because we said then it's not us who should be designing this system. If we want this to be a social infrastructure, we should start designing this with the local communities. And of course, the communities here had already mobilized in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, because they've been through this incredible shock. So they have organized themselves in a group called LES Ready, Lower East Side's Ready, because we focused first on the most vulnerable parts of Lower Manhattan, where many of the low-income people lived in public housing. And we started working with this group on design solutions. And rather than bringing in a design, we brought in at first very typical types of solutions, so that we could have a conversations about, like, how can we approach this? Which type of solution would fit in at the end of your street, or which type of solution could you imagine integrated in your building? And we brought these sort of solutions into a set of meetings, and together with the local population really start making this plan. And I really like this sort of big U that became, and we are now sort of developing that plan forward again with this strong community. Really becomes like a community-driven infrastructure project. And it was an infrastructure project that had such an engaged community because this community had been through all this business of Sandy, which was really devastating. In some way, the problem with the Big U is also the problem that it was the result of dealing with Sandy and sort of making sure that another Sandy wouldn't happen again. And as we start working on these climate adaptation projects and these coastal adaptation projects, we discover that we really need to think bigger than just coastal protection and making that into a social infrastructure, because in the longer term, the problems caused by climate change are going to really increase. This is an image for a study that we are now concluded on Lower Manhattan, where we made a plan for a strategic plan for Lower Manhattan, and you see that towards the end of the century, the city will flood daily. And that is really a different condition. And then higher sea level will start impacting not only the coastal zone, but will really start to impact all the buildings, etc. And combined with increased storm frequency, it really means that you're not only designing for coastal protection, which was the big U, but really need to start thinking about climate adaptation in a much more holistic and integrated way. We need to start thinking about how do we manage stormwater in our cities? How do we deal with sewage overflows? Because the sewage overflows will be blocked by sea level rise. How do we create green cities? So in follow-up projects, and that's why also I think these processes are really great as sort of learning processes, we not only deal with coastal protection, but we start to tackle the entire city. We start to find ways to bring green infrastructure into the city. We try to really think of how can we store the urban water, and that brings with it a whole set of different problems and a whole set of new relationships with communities that you need to build, because we're not working on the coastline itself. And one of the things that we're, for instance, doing in East Haarlem is to see if we can rethink the entire streetscapes and try to green them so that they can start to convey water, but also deal and then with urban heat islands and all these other effects of climate change. But changing a street from a street that is now fully trafficked and has full parking of it into a street that is green and that can convey water really requires a different level of thinking, where you use, in a way, your flood protection to also build social resiliency, to start dealing with issues of open space planning and combine these into addressing different agendas than just your flooding extreme heat. And in the case of East Haarlem, extreme heat, which is made worse in Haarlem because of the lack of tree canopy. And the reason there's a lack of tree canopy is that's a formerly redlined neighborhoods where the poor people were sort of living and the city never really took care of trees, etc. And these poor communities then not only have little tree canopy, they're also the ones that suffer more from climate change, not only in New York, but also in Hurricane Maria, because the people from Puerto Rico start to increase the housing stress. So what you see is that as you adapt to climate change, and as you start to think about these problems become more complex, more multifaceted, and that requires then really a different level of engagement. It requires, in the case of East Haarlem, what we realized, an engagement at the school level. What we have done in this project is not only do the physical design, but we've designed a curriculum on resilience that we teach in the different schools in East Haarlem, because we know that, one, this is a long-term thing. This is something that people have to consider. This is something that the kids that grow up there will be working on for the rest of their lives. We know that kids can talk about these things with their parents and with their aunts, and use the family bonds in this area to really start addressing these issues in a more inclusive way. But it's not only, if you want to combine these physical systems and these social systems, you have a different challenge as well in a city that is as atomized as New York, because you need to start thinking about how do we get these agencies to collaborate, because the DOT and the DEP and the DPR and all these they all have their own agendas, and they're all working on particular things that will fall within their mandates. They don't really work on these sort of integrated problems. So I think really one of the big challenges is then also how do we not only engage these different groups of stakeholders, but these different communities, but also how do we rethink the way government works and the way government collaborates in order to solve these problems. And I really think that that's the great opportunity. It is an opportunity of using climate change adaptation as a way to rethink our cities. And it's also really necessary, because at this moment, we are come out of a century where our cities are sort of made with a sort of relatively similar level of sea level rise and sea level, and a relatively stable level of storms. But that's going to change, and it's going to change dramatically, and it's going to change really, really fast. And from my perspective, as someone who works on resilience and climate change, this is really what is going to be driving the change in cities, and specifically coastal cities, in the next century. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Well done. Yeah, so you say, that's interesting. A very, very big challenge is an opportunity, actually, to start working differently as an urgent question. So it's interesting. You start with a big problem, and it can actually be the driver of a new way of collaboration, a new way of city planning, a new way of working together. Thanks. Let's mirror that with another perspective. She's researched sustainability transitions, kind of linked, I guess, then, at Drift, which is an institute related to the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And she will look at, with the scientific lens of social innovation, to this question of togetherness or collaboration. Give her a big applause and welcome her to the stage for Floor Avellino.
Exciting. Let's see if it happens. Well, while we wait for the slide to appear, there it is. So it's a great honor to be here. I work in Rotterdam, but I actually live in Amsterdam, so it's especially exciting to be here as part of this festival in my own city. To talk a bit about the insights from our research on transformative social innovation. So let's dive straight into what do we mean with those words. We define social innovation in terms of changing social relations, involving new ways of doing, thinking, and organizing. So if you take the example of community energy, obviously there's a very important technological innovation component there. You need the solar panels and the windmills to produce your own energy. But we argue it's also socially innovative in the sense that it comes with new relations between neighbors, between consumers and producers, between citizens and governments. And this also comes with all sorts of new practices, like going to your roof to attend to your solar panels with your neighbors. It requires all sorts of new language and knowledge, and it also requires new organizational forms, such as reinventing the cooperative. And we are interested to understand to what extent can social innovation be transformative, by which we mean to what extent can it challenge, alter, or replace the dominant institutions in the social context. So in this case, how and to what extent can community energy really challenge the existing dominant energy systems that are centralized, fossil fuel-based, etc. So it's this research question that has driven our research project for the past 4 years that we have just finalized. And I warmly welcome you to have a look at the website with all the results of this project. One of the things that we've done in this project is to look at 20 global movements that are working on social innovation and that have transformative ambitions. I'm not even going to try to summarize all them, just one example. Participatory budgeting, which was mentioned before, the idea that citizens get directly involved with deciding how their budgets are spent. It started in Brazil in the 1980s, and it became very popular, and it spread around the world, including Amsterdam in the Indische Buurt, where I actually live. So it's really nice to also be here and to hear this first talk about my own neighborhood. But interestingly, it also spread around the world. So Sintemers et al., they estimated in 2012 that there were between 800 and 1,500 participatory budgeting initiatives around the world. By now it's probably much more. And the interesting thing is that many of them are connected and they interact and learn from each other. A completely different example is the Impact Hub. This is the Impact Hub Amsterdam. Also in the east of Amsterdam, this is their previous location. And it's a community of about 300 social entrepreneurs that not only share a co-working space, but they also share a particular way of working where they try to make a living while at the same time really having a positive impact on society. Also, they are part of a global network where we see that there are 100 impact hubs with 16,000 members across 19 cities in 44 different countries. And again, they learn from each other and they are in contact. So these were just a few examples. There are many more, including digital fabrication workshops such as Fab Labs and hackerspaces, but also something completely different like the Via Campesina Farmers Movement. And what we have done is we have studied these movements in terms of the global networks and how they operate at this global level, but we also zoomed in to see how do they manifest at the more national, regional and local level. We looked at 100 initiatives in more than 27 countries using various different research methods. But we also wanted to go beyond producing research deliverables. So we tried to get representatives from all these movements together to see that even though these movements are extremely different and have very different priorities and languages and perspectives, what are some of the principles that you can see across all these movements? So we have developed a manifesto, again, online for everyone to see and download and adapt. So what I want to do with the remaining time is to show you some of the main insights that we got both from the research, but also that we try to kind of summarize and synthesize in the manifesto. So the first is this idea of translocal connectivity. What you see is all these movements are very locally rooted, extremely locally rooted, but at the same time very globally connected. But this connection is not only across national borders, it's also between different cities, between different regions, but also between the urban and the local, between the urban and the rural. And what you see is that it's this translocal dimension that really empowers people, because on the one hand, they feel they really can make a difference in their own neighborhood and they can really see materialized effects of their activities. And at the same time, they also feel connected to other places in the world, which also increases their sense of impact on a more global level. So it's this translocal, as it's called, connection that really empowers people. Another thing that all these global movements have in common is that they all emphasize the need for a different economic system, that our current economic system is really the cause of a lot of social and ecological problems, which I'm not going to go into, but I think many of you are aware of them. They were also mentioned before. And all the movements stress the need to come with diverse and alternative economies. And what we have done is we have compared the many different perspectives, and we have identified 4 overall clusters that a lot of these perspectives share. So the first cluster is this idea of incubating social entrepreneurs. So you bring entrepreneurs together that also have a societal goal, and you enable them to do their thing and to upskill and upskill their businesses. A different perspective is more on the need for personal lifestyle change and for living in community, where the focus is more on reducing the distance between consumption and production, where it's much more about the idea of degrowth and relocalizing the economy. A third perspective, referred to as the collaborative economy. Some people also refer to it as the sharing economy or the platform economy. There's like 1,000 different alternative economies nowadays. Here it's much more about redesigning and also sharing goods in a different way, and also providing the digital platforms that connects people to each other. And then last but not least, under the name of solidarity economy, there is much more focus on really changing the political system, on political institutional reform. And the interesting thing is that there are many differences across these different perspectives, many disagreements also, but they also complement each other in very interesting ways. And some of the most exciting initiatives and movements that we have studied really borrow and use elements from these different perspectives. The third insight that we emphasize is that social innovation and transformative change really comes from diverse institutional contexts. There is a tendency to associate social innovation as something that has to come from the citizens or from civil society. But in the examples that you gave really demonstrate, and all the other cases that we have studied also do that social innovation really emerges in different institutional contexts, like participatory budgeting was actually initiated by the mayor of Porto Alegre, so it really came from within the government. So the conclusion being that also the relations between the state, the market, and civil society are continuously changing, and this in itself is a type of social innovation in itself. And more importantly, not only are the relations changing, but also the logics of each of these contexts is being challenged and renegotiated through these initiatives. A lot of these initiatives, especially in the beginning, they are like institutional nomads. They often don't fit in a specific context. And on the one hand, that's really a problem, which comes with all sorts of financial pressure and difficulties to survive as an initiative, but it's also an opportunity because this enables these initiatives to come up with innovative hybrid organizational forms rather than stretching and conforming to the existing. So it is this very moment where innovation, when innovation is confronted with the institutionalized context, this is the most excited moment because this is where the transformative impact can happen, but it's also the very risky moment where the innovation can get stifled and suppressed. So we all know the example of Airbnb, where the idea of sleeping on each other's couch around the world, such as in couchsurfing, has been translated in a very successful commercial business model that is being exploited by a big firm. With all sorts of implications for cities around the world, as we know. And we see that there is increasing criticism and concern about these kind of developments of the platform economy, such as Airbnb and Uber, where some people even argue that after whitewashing and greenwashing, we now also have we-washing, where community and sharing has also become commercialized and commodified. This is important to give attention to, and at the same time, and we haven't studied this one, but I would like to in the future. As researchers, we always end with what we want to research in the future. But this one is these initiatives like We Can Do Better Than Uber, which is London-based, where there are initiatives to try and take the good things of the platform economy and how can we provide the alternative and the ethical and cooperative alternatives to these kind of developments. So in conclusion, we argue that social innovation is paradoxical and political, and that it has a dialectic relation with institutions. So on the one hand, it challenges them, but it also reproduces them. And it means that for social innovation to be transformative, it has to engage in politics. It has no choice but to do that. And as one of our innovation scholar colleagues argues, for innovation to be successful in doing that, it needs on the one hand to mainstream to translate its innovative ideas to the mainstream context, but at the same time really protect and nurture its radical core at the same time. So what this means is that a lot of initiatives need to have a very diverse and flexible portfolio of strategies that are often paradoxical. So this is why I'm so fascinated by these global movements that I showed, because many of them really succeed in this paradoxical diversity. For instance, the global eco-village movement, on the one hand, you really see that people are with their hands and their feet in the mud, literally building their own houses, growing their own food. But at the same time, they're also involved in protest marches against the oil industry. But at the same time, they also, the Global Eco-Village Network collaborates in all sorts of capacity building and education projects. They also, together with the Transition Towns Network and the Permaculture Network, developed Ecolisa, which is a meta-network which really aims to make the connection with the European Union, with municipalities, where the question is really, okay, it's not enough to have these radical eco-villages in rural space. We also really need to make the connection with what can we learn from these radical experiments to retrofit our cities, etc. So it's really about recreating these connections. And then my final slide is my favorite quote of all times. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind and still retain the ability to function. One should, for instance, see that things are hopeless and yet remain committed to make them otherwise. Thank you very much.
Nice. Thanks. Please, Flora, stay on the stage. Yes. So is it a coincidence that almost all the social movements or initiatives you studied, social innovation examples, relate to sustainability?
No, and that's again something that has to do with the selection bias of research, of the research project, that we really focused on on initiatives that are working on social innovation and that have a transformative ambition. So we really selected them in those terms. So
let me
there are also examples that are not. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting because you could say that the urgency of climate change, of depredation of nature, of the biodiversity crisis in the world, actually makes it the very tiring demand you have, opposing views in one mind and still the ability to do good. It's quite tiring task that you do that only when the urgency is really high.
Yeah.
I mean, you really want to transform the world because you think it's necessary.
Well, that was one of the reasons that, for instance, in East Haarlem, we thought about building this curriculum, because East Haarlem has not really been hit by Sandy.
Yes.
People have other stuff on their minds.
Yes.
They worry about displacement, they're hot, they worry about getting to their jobs and things like that. Whereas in Lower Manhattan, it has been hit by Sandy, so people really knew what was going on.
Yes.
And so that provided an opportunity to do things and to do them really quickly with a really engaged community. Whereas in East Haarlem and in the project that I'll be showing tomorrow for San Francisco, where also nothing really has happened, the real focus at first is to have people understand these type of problems and also understand these problems as related to their problems. Because if a storm hits East Haarlem, the housing, the displacement is going to be much worse than the displacement problems they have now.
Yes. So let's see what kind of curriculum we're now building today, right? Starting with the story of Mexico on labs and also imagining the city, owning the city, making the city. We went to you to actually all kinds of examples where you say we need to, in your terms, but we need to change the way we work. Completely opposing the way we construct cities, make cities. And then you came and you said, well, the urgency for me is also the context. The climate change is making it really necessary to do so. It gives you an opportunity to do it. It gives you also perhaps the momentum to actually engage citizens in different ways. And then you show up at the stage and you say, okay, this is really relevant because you are part of a global movement, actually, without probably knowing it. I think that is what's happening now in summarizing your presentations. What is, in your view, if you studied all these social innovations, what are key, if we call that design principles of successful togetherness or collaboration? What are design principles of processes that makes collaboration successful? Yeah,
there are many design principles.
Yeah.
Well, I think one important thing is actually, because I skipped over that in the presentation, but that's of course where it starts, the sense of urgency, but also to see the connectivity between different crises.
Yes.
As Naomi Klein once said, let's not play the my crisis is bigger than your crisis game. So yes,
I always like that game.
Yeah. So the climate change crisis is huge, but if you connect it then to the economic crisis, as well as you can call it the democratic crisis or whatever you want to call it, and the ICT revolution. If you connect all these different global game changers that we would call them, and then find ways of locally responding to them at the same time, I think that's a very important one. So really playing into these global game changers. And I find it fascinating that a lot of these initiatives that we studied, like eco-villages, people see them as like radical, marginal initiatives, but you would be surprised at their global meetings how strategic they are in thinking about these global crises and playing into them.
Integral, the new word in everything. Thinking. Yeah. And connecting all these different challenges into your own smaller or local initiative is key of a successful collaboration.
But that also brings, I think, for me as a designer, always a huge problem. So on the one hand, you want to maybe use design to show how integral can work, and you want to show the sort of complexity in a way of these problems. At the same time, it is so important that people have agency and that things are actionable. Yes. And that requires, in some way, simplification.
To be simple sometimes, yeah.
And so as a designer, you have this sort of weird and freaky responsibility to sort of engage in a sort of editing process, which I found morally very difficult.
Yes.
But I also know that someone needs to do it, and it's extremely important to do it.
And then you have to think, of course, about the legitimacy of that editing process, right?
Yes, and then in the particular case of us, we work for city governments.
Yes, so that helps.
They pay us. And so to play that dynamics between a city that might not want to engage in certain conversations and a community for whom it is very important to have these conversations, and our need to have a community in there as a long-term stakeholder, because they're the ones that stay in those neighborhoods. That's not the designers, it's not the politicians, it's not the administrators, it's the communities who have are in it for the long haul.
Okay.
Mr. Bouw, according to some groups of astrophysicists, in the next 20 years we may very well enter a new little ice age. Do you take that into account as well? Because in that...
Okay. Yeah, do you take that in account? No.
I think those groups are a minority. We basically just, I mean, there's a New York City panel of climate adaptation or climate change. And basically they are the ones who deliver the data with which we work. And I cannot do anything else than to sort of take that scientific consensus as the baseline for where we work. The one thing that we try to talk to people is don't think that the data are where you're going to end up. There's a whole range of outcomes that could be possible.
Okay, no, so yeah, you say sometimes, and that is of course sometimes problematic. I mean, you use consensus data and outlier data is not used.
One thing I like to emphasize that consensus is a religious argument.
Thanks. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Flo, I'm happy that you brought in the global networks, because I'm curious, all forms of participation so far focus on the participation on the local level, but these networks are forming, and you have it easy, you have a space, but these networks don't. So how do these networks help, the cities help us, for example, as a youth network in the climate area to form? Because we need the help of the cities that have spaces and capabilities.
So what is the link between the local and the global? Because not all issues are neighborhood related, but sometimes they're global issues, global movements, and they need physical, support. Yeah. Who wants to say
Well, I think that's what actually a lot of these networks try to provide, is literally spaces. And that's why I'm also increasingly uncomfortable using the term social innovation, because it focuses only on the social, while the whole point is, I come from a field that's very much about technological innovation, so that's the dynamic, you get social innovation to emphasize that.
So
but
new work.
Actually very much social material innovation, in the sense that you need these material spaces to make these differences, and you need to provide in your city spaces for people to convene around things that might not necessarily be directly related to that city at that point in time, but in the end, yeah.
Are there examples?
I think in let's say resilience land, and resilience is an equally overused word, or maybe even more, because there's all kinds of funding streams, supranational funding streams connected to it. But in the resilience space, there's a lot of exchange. And part of what I'm really excited about is that we, in this world, really sort of test the pilots, monitor them, and communicate those so that they can be replicated at other places. And there's a really, in making the decisions about what to invest in, the replicability and the scalability of solutions is a concern even more often than the local acuteness.
Yeah, I have a question for Fleur. I found your mapping of movements fascinating. Have you found a common trend between them in terms of who are the enemy or what they are against for certain power structures, certain dogmas?
Yeah. What are they opposing?
The capitalistic neoliberal system. I think that's...
You were expecting that
I don't know if you wanted to hear that, but...
You were expecting that answer. You wanted to confirm, yeah. No, if I had more time, I would always say, okay, that really sounds like a question where we already know the answer. Please, can you answer?
But that's why these movements are so interesting, yes. Because a lot of movements, that's why we also use the term social innovation and not just social movements, because a lot of social movements start from resistance and critique. And what these have in common, these 20 specifically, is that that's their starting point, and then the next question is imagining the alternative. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in that sense, it's really related to the topic of improving cities.
Yes.
The imagination of the alternative is really an essential step to become transformative. That is, I think, really interesting. Thank you so much for this. I'm looking at the time. Thank you for your presentation and the talk. Thank you. Give them a thank you. It's a quick roundup, right? I mean, what is happening everywhere? What knowledge is there? And we can benefit in combining these streams of knowledge. For now, on the program is a small break because we have 4 other speakers. But the good news is, because we went a bit over time, is that one of the speakers missed her flight. Now that's bad news, of course. But the good thing is that means that although we take a break, we still will end in time. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, for now, a 10 to 15 minutes break. There is coffee behind this venue. There's a coffee bar open. There is a cash machine. But you can also go downstairs at the bar or outside for a little bit. Thank you, and see you in a few minutes, in 10 minutes. Good. So, everybody, great that you're all back. We're going to continue the other perspectives. You're still getting a perspective from Sao Paulo, from Mumbai, and from Tehran. So that's going to be fun. The perspective you're going to miss is from Priya Prakash. She's the founder and CEO of Design for Social Change. She was the one who missed her flight. And that means that Marcela Ahuda will be the only one in this little block who will give her presentation, and then we have some questions, and then you have to do that all alone. All alone. You can manage probably. So let's continue. She's the executive director at Instituto a Cidade Precisa de Forte. No, it's probably not good. I tried. It's unbelievable difficult for me in Portuguese. The City Needs You Institute, that helps. Yeah, from Sao Paulo. Give her an Amsterdam welcome to the stage. Marcela Ahuda.
Yes, because I walk a lot. Well, good afternoon. I feel really honored to be here because I feel like I have a huge responsibility of representing a lot of people. I hope I don't let them down. I'm from São Paulo, from Brazil. As you may see, São Paulo is still really like a prisoner of this success and development and progress narrative. So we put thousands of public money into this bridge that it's only for cars, for example. And we also have this social inequality that it's quite visible in our cities, not only São Paulo, but other cities in Brazil. And that's quite a challenge. But it's also a challenge, how do we face our history? Because many of the times it's really hard to actually actualize them. Like we really leave our past or our history to traces. And we're still a bit we still believe in like this kind of mobility. Of course, there is a lot of people waking up, but still we are stuck literally in these kind of situations. And recently we also had it was a gasoline strike, and it really stopped all the country. So it really showed how we need more flexible and multiple models. And this is a river, is Rio Tietê, and it's like this. It's not natural. This is soap that you clean your dishes, and that goes to the river. And we also build this kind of landscapes with our cities, with our high density. So this is a landfill. And we also destroy a lot of landscapes. So this is in the interior of Brazil. That, well, there was a forest here, and still in this monoculture and mono-thinking way, we keep building this kind of landscapes. And this is a picture from hydroelectric. It's called Belo Monte. So to build that, to produce energy for the biggest cities in the country, we did that. And even though it's a city with, like I said before, high density, there's a lot of people living there, there is really, it's missing this sense of, well, community. Today we listen about loneliness, so this is also a problem. And then I bring that quote. So, we that here inhabit are fruit of this violent friction between a culture that has imposed upon so many others. And we are the ones that, through the knowledges that resist and exist through common memory, can decolonize ourselves and the destructive social way of relating to the life that imposes upon us. That was a free translation, but I think it really shows how right now we are beginning to understand what's this richness that we have in our country and in our culture. And this concept, it's from Alberto Acosta, the Buen Vivir, which is like well living, kind of. So right now there's a lot of people who are starting to think about that. So to live well does not mean how much one produces, consumes, or accumulates, but to live with an intensive sufficiency. So what would that mean? No? And we really, as we face today, we face the same challenges. So how to connect the problems with local solutions and how to think territorialize and in a systemic way. Also how to approach the future now, so think of scenarios and think that we need to work with structure, but also with program, with use, as many as you said before. And how to create this real democracy, that will mean to guarantee diversity, to have social inclusion and guarantee the right to the city. And we have the objectives of sustainable development, which are really important and beautiful, but how do we put it in practice in our specific context? And I'm going to bring now, I think our presentations, Flor, are really complementary because I'm going to focus more on the specific cases in São Paulo and show a bit on the mood and the environment we live now. So it's really São Paulo, it's an ungovernable city because it has like, I don't know, the whole Netherlands in one city, kind of. So how to think that actually, how to think not as a smart city, but as smart citizens, and how do we perceive the citizens as helping hands to create a different city that we want to live in. And in a sense, these grassroots initiatives, they're really putting the new urban agenda in practice. So I kind of separated them in some topics. So the first one would be this creative appropriation of existing spaces. So how do you re-signify a space through use? So this is a viaduct. It's called Minhocão. It was built during dictatorship and it crosses the whole city and it was really like a wound in the city. And today, well, people use it like a park, but it has no infrastructure besides the road itself. An amazing, beautiful, well, landscape that you see through that. And people are starting using it as, for example, for theater. Or this is Avenida Paulista, which is one of the main avenues we have. And also people are starting to, well, use it as a park, kind of. So to walk in bicycles, active mobility, and things like that. This is Parque Augusta, which was a land that was abandoned for so many years, and people started to reclaim it as a park and also named it as a park. So that's really interesting that it adds value, it adds imaginary to this. But also these kind of initiatives, they are looking for a redistribution of property somehow. So how do you co-produce value? So this is a co-housing. It's in a kind of rich neighborhood that had so many big houses empty because, well, the whole family died and the children moved away and stuff. So it's a lot of co-housing movement right now in this kind of situations, but also squads, housing squads, which are like it's been, I don't know, oh my God, time. Well, housing squads and also artistic squads, and but also this matter of art as resistance. So how throughout aesthetic language you tell a story. So this is a really interesting place in center. Also the saraus, which are cultural activities that people occupy the squares, and it's really related to cultural identity and to, well, telling a story. And this is slums, which are activities that have been happening a lot, and it's really beautiful because they bring people from all over the city, mostly in center. So this is a square in center of São Paulo. But they really talk about what it means, social inequality in practice, and they really speak up. And it's really sad, actually, to see how many of those movements are criminalized or are oppressed by police also. And, well, let's continue. Besides that, these movements are innovating in energy production, also in food production. So this land, because it has the wire and the electricity power, it cannot be used for construction. So people are doing gardens, urban gardening on that. Also another place really in the periphery of the city which was abandoned, and it's now an urban garden, and they involved old ladies from the community, so they are really learning about agroecology and more diverse ways of producing food, and also natural cosmetics. This is also in the periphery, but in the south. So this guy, Fabio Miranda, he started the institute, and he teaches how to, for example, build solar panels or how to make biodigester by food compost. And he teaches there. So more than 5,000 people learned with him and are putting those systems in their own houses in the slum. So talk about energy production and these things. And besides that, many of those movements, they see residue as a resource. So this is an app that was created and also got many prizes that connects the closer garbage picker to your home, because it's really today like a Brazilian produces kind of 200 kilos of garbage per year, and of these 240 kilos are recycled, so it's nothing. And from these 40 kilos, 90% who does the recycling are garbage pickers. So how to understand their importance today in the chain. Also domestic compost, and also, for example, taking PET bottles to create this other relationship with water inside the city. So this is really something that when you think of São Paulo, you don't think about that. Oh my God, my time. And then they're also talking about psychological support. So even the simple things, so like bike angel, so that you have someone that will help you to guide you through the city. Or also when, for example, we had this a building was on fire in the center, and then people stayed in the square, and they had a lot of solidarity networks helping out, but also psychologists that have a public clinic. And in the end, they are really protecting the commons. So they're really trying to preserve citizens and city patrimony. So, for example, this is a land that was abandoned. It's really close to the Teatro Oficina, which is a quite known theater, was built by Lina Bobardi. And today they want to build like a shopping mall in this area, and this will have an impact on lighting, on the whole neighborhood. So people are really manifesting and really putting their efforts into aesthetical manifestation also to start talking about that. Or also the relationship to water. So many buildings, they just throw water away in the public system. So this group, they are starting to get this water, which is clean from the rain, and to make like open and public aquatic parks. And this is one of the projects I'm working on now, which is called Escola Sem Muros, a school without walls. So the idea is that we help. This is a space, well, this is a cultural space in north of the city. It's called Jardim Damasceno, and it's been there for 25 years that people have activities with children and also with elderly and environmental consciousness activities, and they're super close to the park. So it's really important that they are there talking about ecology. But as you see, the structure is kind of double. I don't know if I can say this word. So the idea is that we through architecture, we build a new structure for the place, and also using architecture's value and status to legitimize their fight and to legitimize the work that they do there. And even though they're there for 25 years, they had never been recognized. And now, last year, we did a crowdsourcing campaign, and we got 40,000 reais, and we couldn't build the thing because the municipality arrived and said, no, you cannot build it because it's illegal. And so really to think about who owns the city and who has the right to actually, who is legitimate to make it, right? And well, a lot of things, but in the end, that's the thing, like how to protect these commons and how to foster and support and also, well, network these people who are doing a lot for their cities, but they're not being as valued as they should. And at the same time, how to get scale, so how to understand that this is a bigger thing. And then, in the end, I work for A Cidade Precisa de Você, The City Needs You, which we work exactly with urban education, so urban pedagogy, how to create this active citizenship mindset, but also how to work really hands-on, so prototype and understand that it's really you need to work and see and it's a constant analysis process, but also doing process and doing together. So build community capacity for those places to remain. I'm sorry I got my time done, and thank you very much.
Oh, stay here. So in the break, stay here. In the break, somebody came up to me and he said, okay, very precise now. Please be more precise. He said that to me. And I always love it when people say this, they try to improve it. So the difference between cooperation and collaboration. And in Dutch, of course, samenwerking, it's the same, but it's actually not the same. And the good thing is that I want to talk about cooperation, also the movement of cooperatives and commons. And it's a really relevant aspect of this new movement we are trying to research this afternoon. And luckily you came on stage and talked about commoning, right? Or the cooperative. In a definition for those who are not familiar with the term, it's not public, it's not private, but something in between. Kind of fussy as a definition. But what can you tell me a little bit to help that person also get acknowledged in his analysis that there is a difference between collaboration and cooperation? What role do these cooperatives, these new commoning, do in your city to actually improve or access owning the city and the entire conversation we had before the break?
Well, as Gabriela said in the beginning, I think it's maybe a thing on Latin America, that there's really a mistrust on the state, so people don't expect nothing.
And I think that is global, but it's worse in Latin America. In the Netherlands now, it says that 40% of the people trust politicians, 99% believe in democracy. So 99%. So lots of believe in the democracy, but if you ask them, do you trust politicians? It's only 40%, but okay.
Yeah, and so I really believe that those people, they are responsibilizing themselves and really taking into their own hands. And this commons exactly what you said. So it's really in between space, because at the same time that you think, oh, for example, this last project that I showed, School Without Walls, it's a space that has a group, so it's a private group that's been managing this place for 25 years. But actually, I would say that the difference is that they manage it like it's really a private group, but they manage it really like openly. So they really are open for access of everyone. Everyone that gets there can do something, can propose something. So that would be the difference, that they have like a public character or a public intention behind, but of course they are a group, a specific group that, yeah.
Now, and the cooperative is, of course, in Latin America, a really developed notion, an organizational matter. Only look at the way farms or farmers are organized in cooperatives. So it's a big known way of organizing your society.
Yeah. And it's also really a cultural heritage in a way. But it's really crazy to see that still today those movements are really criminalized. So they're not taken into account, because still property has this intangible value and aura around it. So it's really important that, and that's why maybe it's really good to be here. Or, for example, we're doing a movie on that, really to try to change the people's mindset and try for them to start seeing this as what it is, and not just as people breaking into somebody else's property. Yes. So that's really another narrative that we're trying to build. And it's really interesting to see that many of those places and fights, they are connected. So, for example, this Parque Augusta, which was this abandoned green area in the center of the city, they mapped out more than 40 areas in the city in the same context. And now they created a movement called Terra Livre. So it's really trying to understand how these situations, they are specific, but they are really recurrent in the city and repetitive, and how to try to make this agenda, right?
Interesting. So, and I think it's also really relevant to sum up your presentation, that the role of the other half, as you called it, in not really common in city planning or management, not the political scientists or the planning or the architects, but the designers as well, and the artists as well. And I mean, you show how the role of art in actually putting this different way of owning the city, or access to the city, or the right to the city with artists, right? And the relevance for that.
Yeah, and that's really strong, and I think it's really also maybe Brazilian, because it's really this movement of resistance. It's resistance, but it's also existence. So it's really creative. It's what Flor was saying in the beginning, that they start arguing and pushing the boundaries of whatever is there already, but they also propose new alternatives. So that's the more valuable part, and that's when you start talking to people who are not in the same thinking or frequency that you are, because exactly then people start, I don't know, playing in this aquatic park, and then they realize, oh my God, but this water come from this building and they are throwing this water away. So it's a way of trying out a much more accessible language rather than putting papers of notices.
Yeah, very inspiring. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you. Okay. Let's go to the last round of 2 presentations. And we're going to travel all the way to Mumbai in our imagination. Because if we've learned something today, it's the power and also the necessity of imagining. So let's imagine ourselves now in Mumbai, and let's hear from architect and urban designer Rupali Gupta. Give her a welcome to the stage.
Okay. I think what I'll do is, let's see how I do with time, and then I'll probably have to skip some slides in the middle. But just to take you to Mumbai and to understand what is going on in the city in the last couple of years, if we there's an entire myth that says that the city is booming, lots of people coming in. There's a whole right-wing kind of politics that says that outsiders are coming into the city. But actually, if you look at the statistics, you'll find that the population is actually not growing. It's stabilized. But what has actually grown is the number of trips of travel in the city and the number of single establishments. And what that actually shows is that the kind of structure of the city that we had, where we had people living in the north, the jobs were in the south, there was a very structured mobility pattern from the north to the south. You had the factories working, you had the 9-to-5 jobs, but that has completely changed. And what has changed, you'll find that people have now become entrepreneurs. They've become fragmented, they've become singular units who are now navigating the city in very, very different ways. So you find this kind of structure that has completely disrupted. On the other hand, you'll find that these entrepreneurs actually also find interesting places in the city. There's a logic to the urban form of the city. So you'll find this is an entrepreneur who's actually found this compound wall, this wall of the city, which is this private property, and she's lodged her shop inside it. This is another, so you'll find that again, you have the typist whose shop is located inside a lawyer's office, right? So there's this kind of shop within shop. And what actually that does is that it's talking to you about the logic of the city. There's a very different logic of the city, which, for example, a lot of our planning norms are not able to fathom. So, for example, when you talk about the smart city, you talk about the GIS, you require very clear polygons that actually talk to you about what property is. But then when you see something like this, you find that completely fails. Yeah, there's a kind of kinship relationship that works where the city is a property within the property. This is a self-built settlement in Bandra, and you'll find that in the self-built settlement, which is multi-storied, you'll find that there's a grocery store, there's an embroidery unit, there's a worker's dorm, there's an owner's house, and on the other side you have utensils which are being rented, these large utensils to make biryani for festivals, and then a mosque and a praying space. All of this together in one space. That's the logic of the city. However, when we look at civil society groups, and this is something that we understand that civil society is also interested in the city, but a lot of civil society is middle class in Indian cities, and you'll find that this logic that we saw is very systematically wanting to be cleaned, and cleaned to make these kind of antiseptic spaces, because we are seeing spaces around us like Amsterdam and other places. We want to make them like that, but we really find that they're actually inhabited by very, very different actors. We want to clean this up, and then there is a very, very smooth takeover of corporate capital. Right? And that's something that is, but then that's the logic of the city that one really needs to think about, because there's an intensity, there's a culture that comes out of that logic. So when we were invited by the Audi Urban Future Initiative to look at the idea of mobility in Mumbai, and there were 6 architects from all over the world who were invited. And we said, we said that, future actually, the way we see it, is located between these two opposite kind of domains. One, we see the future as this occupied by super infrastructure, by the information utopia. And on the other hand, you'll find that it's kind of understood as this catastrophe of poverty that one really needs to take care of. So it's this kind of, opposite utopias, utopia and dystopia through which we see the city. But then we said that, perhaps that's not the way, because that's idea of future is also singular. It's also a modern idea of future, seeing it as a singular future. However, so what we did is we saw 9 areas in the city, and we said that, perhaps you start looking at the trajectories. Each of these conditions in the city actually can have multiple futures depending on the kind of trajectory that one actually sees. And so, this is the kind of multiple city of the futures. I don't have a lot of time to go into this. But then what we started seeing is that in these multiple futures also, there are 4 very clear trajectories that one sees. In the next 20 years, what you find is that there's a trajectory of high polarization that is happening. So for example, if you look at this, a lot of urban renewal is actually creating from the self-built settlement that you just saw, which has what we called high transactional capacities in terms of securities, in terms of networks, kinship relationships. What they're doing is now going into this urban form, the skyscraping urban form. And what that does is that it reduces the transactional capacities on the one hand and the resources increasing on the other hand, whereas you'll find that the informal settlement, the self-built settlement is much less resource intensive, but it's very, very high in transactional capacities. And this is really what is happening. There's a high polarity because now you have walls. These are resettlement colonies. This is buildings where people from these self-built settlements are moved to, relaxing all kinds of bylaws because poor people don't need to breathe. You have light and ventilation deficiencies here. Urban bylaws are actually relaxed for that. And then there's the trajectory of economic restructuring. We just saw that people are now becoming entrepreneurs. So you'll find that the kind of economy, Mumbai was called the finance capital, but now what is actually happening is that it's moving into culture and other things. And one really needs to look at that carefully. We're not doing that. And then the trajectory of high environmental concerns. So all kinds of, we've talked about that before, and you'll find the same in Mumbai. But what is interesting is that you'll find that entrepreneurs are also now engaging in the environmental crisis, and actually there's a whole economy that kind of is built around that. And then the fourth trajectory that we saw is the average age of the city. In the next 20 years, we're seeing that all over, but in Mumbai also we've seen that the next 20 years, it's going to become the city of the old. And so we said, looking at this trajectory, how do we actually look at the future? Again, not as a one singular future, because that's a modern idea. One cannot understand this. There are multiple claimants, there are multiple people who are operating. And so what we do is we design tools. We design tools for various people to engage with these four trajectories in the future. So very quickly going through these. You have, so we made a yellow pages for the new kind of jobs in the future. What can one engage in? The catalog for retrofitting water edges. That's again, you saw the image where the waterfront was cleaned. There was a fishing village right there, but then that's where you stop, because you have no imagination. The imagination of the waterfront is only leisure. Right? And so you have promenades and other things, but how do you actually start engaging with the waterfront in ways in which you start looking at the other claimants? So we made a catalog for that, and the catalog for entrepreneurs. So you'll find there's this kind of, we call it the 1 foot shop. It's only a foot deep, and it is located onto one of the properties. That is the day and night 1 foot shop. When the shutter closes, the night shop takes over. And so what we started doing is started designing these kind of infrastructures. What happens how do you take this one step ahead? Instead of a future which is out there, you look at a future which is just one step ahead of what already exists. So that was the 1 foot shop that we designed. That was the day and night 1 foot shop. That's the 6 inch. It's 6 inch and 6 inches. And then, of course, and this one, which is where the shop touches the city only at one point. So it's kind of there. What we designed was this kind of thing which touches the city in 3 places, but can be rolled away in the case of a raid. And then, other catalogs for greening. I have my time is red. So I think I'll just end with this one. This is a catalog for retrofitting old settlements, because one thing that we understand, again, is always building anew. But we understand that there's a lot of stock which is there in the city, which already exists. How do we retrofit? Because and right now, in our planning courses, in architecture schools, there is really no curriculum that looks at this idea of retrofitting. And that's something that we've started in this architecture school that we run. And I'll end with this last project that we've been working with artists, with housing activists. This is the same resettlement colony that you saw. The government built this with absolutely no social amenities, but you'll find that people started taking over. There's a huge market that has happened here. There are two little units over there, which is 20 square meter deep, and people have actually made a temple out of that. And so we started working with these collaborators. These are all people from the resettlement colony. And with some money that we got from an art grant, we said, let's make, and it was a very loose kind of, it was the idea of the public realm or something. We said, let's create that public realm because it doesn't exist. And so we got this, we got together with the people from that housing society. There was this little shed that they had built already, so they had claimed property. It wasn't owned, but they had claimed with some very, very loose kind of porous legal system, because they had this letter from the government that said, you can use this land. And so they made use of the land. They claimed this little shed, but over the time it had got dilapidated. We said, let's take this and let's retrofit it, let's renovate it. So yeah, we did all kinds of workshops. That's the little shed with these areas here. And we worked with a local welder. So Sharif Bhai is a local welder. These are our partners. He's an artist and a housing activist. And this is one of the largest recycling centers in Mumbai. It's called Kurla. We got all the materials from there and then worked with other agencies, the plumbers, and all of them came from that same locality. And so, yeah, we built the space. All the books over here are all crowdsourced. I mean, those are the books. It's still growing, and now it's completely taken over by the community. So, yeah, thanks.
Very interesting. All the presentations are not only critiquing the neoliberal organization of the economy, but also the modernist approach to city building, right? I mean, almost every presentation hinted to that, and you're quite clear. I mean, the future of city planning is multiple, faceted, multi-layered, and has different trajectories. Thank you so much for that, adding that complex perspective to what cities and the future of cities can be. Thanks. Okay, the last presentation, and now we're going to Tehran, a beautiful, beautiful old culture. Also, let's hear. He's the leading the urban innovation office at Smart Tehran, and his name is Gave Yazdifart. Give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm very honored to be here with you, and specifically as the last speaker before our soccer match with the deadly villain Spaniards, okay? Yeah, we already have 3 points, okay? So you will see why I call this presentation the Urban Leopards. I'm also talking about pushing the boundaries of imagination. And the story I'm going to tell you is the story I've had as I can call myself a teacher and a coach for startups in Tehran, okay? Flor talked about the game that my city is unique. Okay, this is repetitive. But Tehran is very paradoxical. Yeah, and I mean it. I can give you a lot of examples how a lot of paradoxical phenomena happen over there. Well, we are ranking 199 between 231 registered countries for the quality of life. And we have an average cost of 3,000 euros per family per month. Huge. We have more than 40% of the people using personal transportation vehicles, and less than 20% of them using subway. A very developed subway, rather developed subway. And our numbers of polluted weather have risen in the last 2 years from 86 to 105 days of polluted weather. We have a Gini index, if you know, which specified the discrimination and justice here, more than 0.38, which is a rather high discriminative society, but happy. And we have less than 1% green transportation implemented in our country, okay? In this context, we have learned a lot. we have learned how to tackle with a lot of problems. This is my life. You see over there. I started math at high school, then I went to studying chemical engineering because at university I liked it. Then I studied biotechnology in master's, and then a Master of Business in Sweden. Like, lots of people in Iran like to pursue their education outside, okay? And a lot of these people don't come back. That's maybe the most important pity we all have there in Iran. And well, it has not been my case apparently. I continued working in pharmaceuticals in a biggest dairy company, and then working with, can you guess what? With startups. and with a phenomenon or with a species called the entrepreneur. Who is the entrepreneur, and why is it important in my lecture here? It's all about how we move from innovation to entrepreneurship, how innovation has not been able to answer the problems we've had, but entrepreneurship has been answering. We're talking about two phenomena here. Firstly, entrepreneurs are trying to, as you can see, validate a certain business model. They want to, as you said, iteratively and formally prove that a concept can be turned into a valuable and revenue-making business model. So this is their lifestyle. And they are different from other people in the growth ambition that they have inside them, which is rather aggressive. They have a lifestyle which has turned Tehran into a different city with very, very differentiated communities. They are, after changing the concept of business, they are changing the way we look at problems, and they do it all in 3 specific steps. First, they have to prove that the problem is a real problem, the issue. Then they show that their solution is one that really answers to the problem and is really absorbed by the user, and later turning it into a viable business plan and a marketable product. Why am I telling you all this? Because my concern in all these years, in the context that I told you about, is whether this innovation should be top-down facilitated, or can it happen bottom-up? This is the controversy I was having with Flor in the break. She believes we need to have the top-down. Otherwise, I said, what would you do? She said, we will wait until the top-down works. I said, we can't do it. Okay? This is the question we are asking ourselves. Are we solving real problems? And this is the essence of why I changed my job 3 months ago from a venture capital company, which is a very powerful money-making company, investing in startups, to a freelance working with municipality, working with different incubators, and a very different level of interactions, okay? To make sure the startups I'm working with not only create wealth for the shareholders, but also solve real problems. And those real problems, we sourced most of them in the cities. We started a journey looking at the best innovation centers which have led to problem solving. We went to France. I'm going to Berlin next week. And we have people sent to Lisbon to see how these spaces are being effective regarding the problem solving. In France, we visited Station F. How many of you have seen Station F? Only one? My goodness. So Station F is a loveliest place I would choose to be in France. Like last night, I had 4 hours before coming here. And I went to Station F, started working. There you can see a very good collaboration between government, the acceleration programs, which are led by Microsoft, Google, and Facebook, each vertical in different issues and problems we were talking. And a co-working space which is very attractive for the innovators and entrepreneurs. We also visited universities and saw the difference between the approach of universities and, let's say, private incubators, innovation centers, and accelerators. Paris-Saclay, maybe you know this is the aggregation of different universities with an incubator which is unique in its own way, focusing on high-tech problems and specifically on energy, nanobiotech, and other issues. So this is what we end up with. In Tehran, we have this project called the Smart Tehran, okay? And a lot of you can predict most of it is focused on IoT, hardware technologies, and not on the people, okay? How we can transfer technology from best practices in the world. But as most of the speakers focused on, this is a soft human approach if we want to have an impact. So the three things I'm counting for you, first, empowering the community. We have this community already in Iran. We have people who are attending events of user experience design, data science, AI in medicine, and blah, blah, blah. Some of them stay in co-working spaces, spend their times together to enjoy it. Some of them enter the acceleration programs, maybe vertical in a specific field, and then they raise funds, and it continues so that this community, the knowledge and the impact increases. This is what we are doing. We are using unused spaces in Tehran, not as the municipality, but as, let's say, private incubators. And we are turning them into specialized workspaces for them, so that by putting these entrepreneurs together, regardless of what happens top, we can help them empowered in innovation. So this is a sample of the innovation factory that is changing the neighborhood in the, if you've been to Tehran, around the Liberty Tower. It has co-working spaces, accelerators, incubators, and vertical and general, and 10 different factory plants, okay? Huge. After we did that, a lot of companies started imitating. So the business model really resonated, and they said, okay, we have lots of plants left in the city. Why not using them? Second initiative, we understood, hopefully we understood, some of us, that engagement of people through innovative tools is a necessity, as most of you talked about it. Like the papers that you mentioned, or the platforms other people are going to talk about. So we have a data.tehran.ir project, which gives open data access to the entrepreneurs. We have an urban observatory that is designing the data products, and after a lot of struggle with the, let's say, intelligence units and the people who are concerned about the confidentiality, trying to release it into the hands of entrepreneurs. We have ideate.tehran.ir, which is a platform for them to engage in giving their ideas or talking about their problems. And we have events, which is in collaboration with places like Space Organization that has the remote sensing satellite data, or other tech dominance in Tehran. We are having good events and good awards for people to engage in. And we have facilitated pilots for entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs like this website, Keshmoon, is the website that facilitates the sales of saffron. You all know saffron, right? It's very Iranian icon. So the farmers, they have profiles, and their own lives, their children, their daily life, and the quality of their saffron by number is shown to the consumers, and they choose from whom to buy. This is the son of a farmer who has founded this business. He is now trying to export to Europe, and it is growing very well. The second story is the story of Lena. Lena has created her platform for strolling in Tehran. It's called Piyade. Piyade means pedestrian. And you can, in her platform, mobile application, you can find what performances, art performances, galleries, or cafes have been introduced, and you can see the reviews of experts and other peers about them, and choose it in a location-based service. So this is the story of us in Tehran, and we are here to learn. And we know we have to hack our way with regarding where we are today. But I'm very optimistic about it, and I'm asking all of you to please help us with your experiences in urban innovation. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Okay, so Rupali, can you join me on stage for the final thoughts? People are already moving away. We're not going to make this a long thing. But the interesting thing, you used the word hack the system, right? Yeah. And that is also something which I think is, in more than one presentation, the dominant views that you're opposing either through art or, and interesting enough, you are opposing dominant ways of doing things with startup culture. Yep. Sometimes seen as a manifesto of neoliberal policy. So it's interesting. You say I'm using a form of the old regime, but I'm hacking it and I'm trying to use it for the better, for a new understanding of creating futures. So that's interesting for me.
You can see that corporates are coming after us.
Yes.
Say, who are you guys? We have been hearing about you, and what are you doing it? How are you doing it? So can you come into my corporation? Say, no, you can invest in us, but we stay outside to keep the culture.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because I think you are also creating, actually, you don't call them startups in your presentation, but new companies. I mean, with your way of, for instance, the story of the resettling area, right? Yeah, you can take this.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, like I said, economy has changed, the way we inhabit cities have changed, and people have already become entrepreneurs in many ways. There are startups that are, in some ways, there are so many of those that are already going on. And what is interesting is how do we then facilitate these? Yes. Somehow planning doesn't recognize that. There's this whole, like, for example, there's the development plan of Mumbai that is being made right now, but there's this whole thing about, how many square meter area or per person do you increase? But nobody's really looking at where the economy is going. And with that logic, all you do is increase real estate space. Whereas if you find that real estate, the 50% of the real estate is not occupied, right? So there's this whole disbalance between what is actually going on ground and the way we are actually planning cities.
Yes, very clear. Okay, dear audience, thank you so much for being so active. Just sit up straight and let's think of what we've learned today, and perhaps you want to pose a question or have a comment. Yes. And then we'll close off this session. Yes.
I have a question for Kave. Yeah. So we started talking about the Amsterdam model, which basically is bringing together different stakeholders and try to fix problems together. Mm-hmm. How does it work in your specific situation dealing with different stakeholders? And you can correct me if I'm wrong, especially when some stakeholders have can have the last voice on matters. So basically, what are your constraints and what are your... Thank you.
So if I understand clearly, you mean there are stakeholders other than the entrepreneurs, like the investors, like the city urban managers, government. Yeah. This is the thing. This is why I used the word hacking into it, like the discussion we had. We have to be like those leopards, waiting for the right moment that the right government person is over there, and we go to him or grab the moment. This is very difficult because you cannot expect. You cannot tell them what is good. You should use your own way of creating a best practice and making it align with their expectations, with their wins. You should create a win-win situation in which the government can have its own win. May it be a brand, personal brand, may it be a win in the parliament, whatever, and align it with the progress of the ecosystem. Right now, in municipality, we have a new wave of young people from Sharif University, which is the best tech university, and it's strange that technical people are more pragmatic, like engineers. Whenever we have them in municipality, I'm sorry, but it happens much faster. But like some other, like humanities, like architects, they are very detailed, they are very very systematic, and it doesn't fit the way Tehran needs to move on, and it takes longer, and the guy changes. when their planning is finishing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's nice that you now explain what you meant with the leopard. I mean, you need to really grasp the
actually,
moment.
the leopard is the icon of...
Yes, I know. Yeah. So we have to be quick now because the football match almost... When will it start?
8, I think.
Yes. Oh, we have time enough. No. So yeah, it's I know. Let's see. Let's roam the room. Let's see. Yes.
Thanks, Rupali, for your presentation, because you've shown that micro entrepreneurs are sort of the antidote to the startup system that the global capital is trying to foster. But has it forced a rethink in government and municipalities in terms of creating space in urban design for hawkers and things like that?
Yeah.
Effect, for instance, of that beautiful 1-inch shopping experience.
Unfortunately not.
No.
Also, I think one of the things that happens is that sometimes design doesn't understand the logic. Like, I began with this idea of the logic of the city, right? So in some ways there's this, you'll find that there are hawking zones, but for example, you'll find you need to study things much more closely to understand where things work and where they don't. And most of the times you'll find that hawking zones are in places which are not, not interesting for real estate to occupy. So you'll find that happens, and the government is really not understanding that logic of the city really carefully. I mean, really, that's what's going on.
Yes. Okay. Final remark or question? Yes, sir.
I thought you were pointing there. No, just observation, and it's not so much a question, trying to put in perspective all we've heard this afternoon. I like the word micro, something like that. We talked about strategies, but maybe you should learn to develop micro strategies. What I mean by that, there was talk about the translocal, but maybe a city is about neighborhoods. So maybe it's the city as trans neighborhood sort of unit. And we're just not used to it, also as designers not. We keep thinking we have a sense of the city and we have to design it, and we realize lower down on the scale there's the complexity in Mumbai and everywhere else. And I was shocked, talking about Mexico City, 22 million people, that's like 30% more than the whole Dutch population. You can't have one strategy for Mexico City. So we have to learn to turn it around, see what, that was interesting about what Matthijs Bouw was saying, and of course, it's an amazing thing that they've done in New York you said there are local interventions. So we have strategies for local interventions that somewhere on some other level connect and we can learn from one another. And I think that's a challenge we'll face.
Yeah, Michiel Zwart. Yeah, thank you for doing my job. Synthesizing this event, thanks. I would like to thank you first for giving your fantastic presentations and being here in Amsterdam, but also a little bit in Mumbai and Tehran. Thank you so much for that. Give them a thank you. Yes, language matters, but also the right scale of analysis matters. Integral thinking, I really like that, but also I don't think that people know sometimes what's the best for them, right? I mean, so education, but also city pedagogic, we've learned. So I think I'm not going to summarize and synthesize like you did already, because I think we have had, for everybody here, I see some nodding, some associative red threads through the presentations. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned a lot from each other. That was the goal of this pre-conference, We Make the City. Most of you, some of you will go to the official grand opening with the keynote of Kay Rayworth tonight in West District of Amsterdam. I hope you have a great conference the coming 4 days with all these exhibitions, tours you can take, talks you can be in. Have a great We Make the City festival, and thank you for attending, and thank you to our guests for brilliant presentations. Thank you.